Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Adrian, and if you're listening to this, I suppose I'll tell you a story that, for me, has never had a clear ending. I don't know if what I experienced during those days in the Florida Everglades was real, or if it was my mind playing with me. But today all I can say is that I still feel like something or someone continues following me, watching me from some dark corner. What started as a peaceful vacation with some friends ended up becoming an experience I'll never be able to forget. One that constantly torments me, even when I try to leave it behind. It was the month of July. The heat of the Florida peninsula felt like a dense, sticky blanket that wouldn't let you breathe. The group of friends I had planned this trip with and I were staying at a small eco-lodge near a town forgotten by time. The place was a hidden paradise among the vegetation, surrounded by thick swampland and waterways that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The houses were small, built of cypress wood with metal roofs, and the air was full of that unmistakable mixture of humidity, earth, and wet vegetation. There was something mystical about the place, as if you were in the heart of a primitive world untouched by civilization. We, anxious to explore, took a guided excursion with a local man, Felipe, who knew the swamp like the back of his hand. During the day, we traveled routes full of abundant fauna and flora. We stopped in front of crystal-clear springs and learned about the Seminole culture that had inhabited those lands for centuries. It was fascinating, but something inside me always wanted more. There was a part of me that felt I wasn't living the complete experience if I just followed the group. I needed something more, something of my own, something unique. One afternoon, after lunch, I decided to separate from the group. I wanted to walk alone along a path that disappeared into the swamp and explore a bit more. It wasn't the first time I had done this on other trips, but I had never been so far from home, nor in such a wild environment. I left a note for my friends saying I would return at sunset, but that didn't happen. The trail narrowed as I went deeper into the swamp. The sun was beginning to set, but the shadows among the cypress trees remained dense, almost impenetrable. Each step was followed by the squelching of wet ground under my boots. I felt sweat accumulating on my back, but I was too captivated by the beauty of the place to worry too much about the heat. Here in the middle of nature, hours seemed to vanish as if time had no importance. Little by little, the sound of birds and insects that had filled the air at first began to fade. The swamp, which before seemed so alive, began to become strangely silent. At first I didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just a coincidence, a change in the wind or a natural variation in animal behavior. But soon, a distant noise made me stop dead. It was a low, rhythmic sound, as if someone was walking among the wet leaves, but with very heavy steps. However, I saw nothing, only more trees and Spanish moss, the infinite swamp in front of me. At first I thought it was some large animal, maybe an alligator or some black bear. I was about to continue on my way when the noises became clearer. They weren't just footsteps, but a peculiar dragging, as if someone was pulling something through the water, maybe a stick or a thick branch. But the strange thing wasn't just the noise, but that it was approaching. It couldn't be an animal because the sound seemed too directed, as if someone or something that shouldn't be there was walking toward me. My heart began to beat faster, and without thinking too much, I decided to continue forward, walking faster, hoping to find someone from the group or a path to the lodge. But as I advanced, the sound continued, now closer, more persistent. I stopped and looked around. The swamp was so dense I couldn't see beyond a few meters. The sun was already very low, the shadows long and dark, and suddenly a cold breeze ran down my back, something strange in such a hot place. I began to feel pressure in my chest, as if the air had become thicker. The sound was now so close I felt I had it behind me. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. I kept walking, now in panic. Each step seemed heavier, as if the earth itself was resisting me, as if something invisible was slowing my movements. Suddenly I heard a whisper, as if someone was speaking in my ear. I didn't understand the words, but I felt it so close, so real, that my skin crawled. I looked back once more. Nothing. The swamp seemed equally dense, equally empty, but then I saw it. A movement among the trees, something dark, a barely visible figure sliding among the shadows. I couldn't distinguish well what it was, but the human outline was clear. It couldn't be one of my friends or Felipe. There was no one else on the trail. Suddenly, as if I had summoned it, the sound became louder. It was a dragging accompanied by heavy steps, as if that figure was approaching quickly. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to flee or stay still, but what I felt at that moment was an urgent need to get out of there. I ran without thinking. My breathing accelerated, my steps sounding too loud in the stillness of the swamp. Behind me, the noises continued, and I felt the presence of something pursuing me, something I couldn't see, but knew was there. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I reached a fork in the trail. In the distance, I saw a light, and my heart jumped when I recognized the lodge. I came out of the swamp panting and with tense muscles. When I got to where my friends were, I told them what had happened, but they looked at me with bewilderment. No one else had heard anything or seen anything. Felipe told me it might have been an alligator or some wild animal, but I knew what I had felt. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't something that could be explained with logic. That night, already in the safety of the lodge, I tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every creak outside the house, every whisper of wind through the trees made me jump. I knew I wasn't alone, and I hadn't been during the entire journey back. Today, months after those days in the Everglades, I still wake up some nights with the feeling that someone is watching me from the darkness. I can't stop thinking about that figure among the trees. I can't stop wondering what it was, and if somehow what I saw or what I felt is still there in the swamp. I don't know if I'll ever return to that place, but I'm sure of something. I wasn't the only one who heard those noises, and I wasn't the only one who felt I wasn't alone. Several months have passed since I returned from the Everglades, and despite trying to convince myself that everything was a product of my imagination, something inside me keeps insisting it wasn't so. I try to ignore it, continue with my life as if nothing had happened, but nights are the hardest. In every dark corner, in every creak I hear at the end of a hallway, I feel that sensation of being watched has never left me. I decided to return to work shortly after my trip. The routine and bustle of the city seemed like a good antidote for the anxiety that pursued me. But what's curious is that over time, I began to receive strange messages from my friends who who accompanied me on the trip. At first they seemed like jokes without much sense, but with each new message, the feeling of discomfort grew more. One of my friends, Pablo, wrote to me a couple of weeks after the trip saying that despite not having talked much about what happened at nights, he still had nightmares about the swamp. I asked him what he had dreamed, but he couldn't explain it. He commented that even during the day, there were moments when he felt someone was watching him from the edge of his vision. He was restless, but was making an effort not to give it importance. I responded telling him he shouldn't worry, that everything was fruit of the trip's emotion, that the swamp has that effect on people. But after receiving that message, a question began to haunt my head. What if it wasn't just my perception? I decided to call Felipe, the local guide, to see what he thought about what had happened to us. I didn't dare tell him everything I had felt in the swamp for fear he would think I had lost my mind. But I asked him if he had ever heard strange stories of people who went alone into the marshland. Felipe, after a long silence, responded with a low voice, almost as if he feared talking about it. There are stories, yes, he said, stories of people who have gotten lost in the swamp and never returned. But they're not stories one tells lightly. The swamp has its own rhythm, its own life, and sometimes it's not so kind to those who stray too far. I remained silent, waiting for him to continue, but he didn't. For a moment, I felt I had touched something deeper, something even he didn't want to name. That same night, while having dinner alone at home, I couldn't help but think about his words. The swamp has its own rhythm. What did he mean by that? I knew that the legends of Florida, the stories of the Seminoles, talked about places where time bent, where the normal and extraordinary intertwined. But I never thought something like that could have impact on me, on my reality. In the following week, after that conversation with Felipe, I returned to feel that strange pressure. That sensation of being watched wasn't something evident, it wasn't something tangible, but somehow like a subtle presence, something or someone was stalking me. I began to see blurry figures at the edges of my vision, and every time I looked quickly, it seemed something moved between the shadows of my apartment. I didn't know if it was paranoia, or if something really had stayed with me after the trip. It was then that one night, while walking through the park near my house, something unusual happened. While walking distracted, I noticed that, just like in the swamp, the sound of the city seemed to fade. The cars, the footsteps of passers-by, even the birds seemed to have silenced. What seemed even stranger was that I got the sensation someone was following me. At first I thought maybe it was someone who simply was going in the same direction as me, but that feeling of discomfort grew when I started to hear the sound of footsteps behind me, always at the same distance. I turned several times, but saw nothing. No one. The shadows of the street stretched out, and the light from the streetlights, although dim, revealed nothing. I decided to accelerate my pace without looking back, but that sensation of being watched didn't leave me in peace. I got home quickly, with my heart accelerated, but once inside I thought maybe what I was feeling was just the echo of what I had experienced in the swamp. Fear is contagious, and now every noise, every shadow seemed to intensify because of that feeling of insecurity. The next day I found something strange at my door, a small, perfectly round and smooth stone with something engraved on it. It was a figure that at first I couldn't identify. It seemed like a Seminole symbol, but it wasn't exactly the same as any I had seen during the trip. Without thinking much about it, I kept it in a drawer without giving it too much importance. Maybe it was a joke from one of my friends, or even something someone had left by mistake, but something told me I shouldn't ignore it. Over the days, I began to remember more details from the trip that I had left in oblivion. In one of the springs we visited, before separating from the group, I had seen a similar stone, although larger, at the bottom of the water. I remember feeling attracted to it, as if something was calling me. Somehow I had forgotten it until that moment. Could it be that stone had been left there intentionally, that someone else had placed it in my path? My mind began to create a series of connections I couldn't understand. The swamp, the symbol, the sensations I couldn't explain. I began to worry that maybe what I had experienced hadn't been just a nightmare. Maybe I had touched something I shouldn't have. I decided to call Pablo, the friend I had been closest to during the trip. I told him about the stone, about the sensation that still pursued me. I was worried about him, about the dreams he mentioned, about what he might also be feeling. To my surprise, Pablo responded very similarly to how I felt. He said that despite trying to continue with his life, he couldn't stop thinking about how strange everything had been. "Adrian," he told me with a trembling voice, "there's something we're not seeing. It's not just the swamp or the legends. It's as if something had stayed with us. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel it. I feel it in my whole body." At that moment, I realized I wasn't crazy. We weren't just two people with an unbridled imagination. What we had experienced was real in some way. And that sensation of being watched, of not being alone, was something I couldn't simply forget. Maybe I would never know what it was, but something told me that in some corner of the Florida Everglades, something had marked us. And maybe, just maybe, we still hadn't gotten away completely. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Diego, and although I was born in a noisy city full of hurry, I've always been attracted to the idea of completely disconnecting from routine. Sometimes the bustle of work, my phone notifications, and the endless hours in front of the computer leave me empty. That's why I decided it was time to get away from everything and look for something beyond the everyday. So without thinking too much about it, I planned a trip to the mountains of Colorado. I had never been to that state, but I had always heard about the beauty of those landscapes. It was said that the Colorado mountains were a perfect place to find peace and tranquility, far from the chaos of urban life. I decided to make the journey alone, hoping that the silence of nature would help me find some clarity in my head. I arrived at a small town in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, a remote place where the houses are made of log cabins, and the streets don't have names, just numbers. At first, I didn't see many people around, just a few elderly folks who moved slowly among the mountain shadows. What impressed me most was the fresh, clean air that hit my face when I got off the bus. It was something completely different from what I was used to. I stayed at a small cabin I rented from a man named Don Gregorio, who seemed to be the only owner of all the land. His cabin was surrounded by towering pines that swayed in the wind. Every time I looked at the trees, I felt they were watching me. But it was a sensation that attracted me rather than scared me, as if nature itself had something to tell me. The next day, I decided to explore the place. The weather was perfect for walking. The sun was gentle, and the wind wasn't strong enough to bother me. So I left the cabin with my backpack, ready to travel the trails that the townspeople had recommended to me. However, when I had already walked for a couple of hours along the most traveled paths, I found something I hadn't seen on the maps: a narrow, forgotten trail covered with undergrowth that went into a thick forest. There were no signs of people there, not even animals. It seemed like a path that had been abandoned long ago. Something caught my attention. There were no marks or traces of other travelers. I stopped for a moment before making the decision to enter. Something in my instinct told me I should be careful, but I couldn't help feeling a strange curiosity. What could be at the end of that path? Who would have traveled it? So I decided to go ahead. The trail seemed even more intriguing as I advanced. The vegetation was denser than I imagined. The tree branches intertwined above my head, creating a kind of natural ceiling. As I went deeper, the sound of wind and birds disappeared almost completely, and the silence became heavier, almost disturbing. My breathing began to deepen, and something inside me said I was entering a place I shouldn't. Suddenly, I saw a man in the distance, standing in the center of the trail. At first, I thought he was a farmer or some worker from the area, but something in his posture seemed strange to me. He was very still, motionless like a statue, looking toward me. He was an older man, with skin weathered and wrinkled by years of sun exposure. His clothes were simple, a torn denim shirt and dark pants. What was most disconcerting were his deeply dark eyes, almost as if he was looking beyond me toward some other place. I stopped a few meters from him, wondering if I should greet him or continue ahead. He didn't seem to have any intention of moving, but finally, he broke the silence with a low, raspy voice that gave me chills. Although it doesn't sound logical, because it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. "Where are you going, young man?" He asked me without raising his head, as if he already knew the answer. "I'm going to walk the trail a bit," I responded, feeling something wasn't right, but without being able to identify what exactly it was. The man said nothing for a moment, just looked at me with those dark eyes, as if he was evaluating something in me. Finally, he moved his head a little and let out a long sigh. "This trail isn't for just anyone," he said in a grave tone, "and especially not when night begins to fall." I frowned, not understanding well what he meant. "What do you mean?" I asked him, feeling the conversation was getting stranger and stranger. The man approached a step toward me, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of wet earth and something else, something heavy, as if the air had a different density there. "When the sun hides behind those mountains," he said, pointing toward the horizon, "something awakens in this forest. There are those who have disappeared around here. There are those who return, but they're not the same. They never are." Uncertainty took hold of me. I didn't understand what he was referring to, but something in his words made me doubt. I felt I shouldn't continue ahead, but the temptation to know more was stronger than my instinct. "What happens when night falls?" I asked, now with a knot in my stomach. The man sighed again, this time more deeply, and looked at the ground before speaking. "Something follows the trail of those who dare to walk these paths after nightfall. It's not something you can see, it's not something you can hear, but I assure you it's there. And when you feel it close, it's too late to run. The mountain traps you, and you can no longer escape." That's the curse of these places. I tried to laugh as a way to take weight off what I had just heard, but the man showed no sign of humor. His gaze remained fixed on me, and that feeling of discomfort grew, as if the darkness of his eyes was enveloping me. "If you decide to stay, don't say I didn't warn you," he said finally, taking a step back. "When the sun sets, get out of here. Run if necessary." I felt a mixture of disbelief and slight fear. Why would someone talk that way? Was it a trick from a crazy person who had lost his sense of reality? I didn't know, but the idea of continuing to go deeper into the forest after his warning seemed increasingly absurd to me. "Thanks for the advice," I told him with a trembling voice, and without waiting for a response, I began to retreat along the trail with my eyes fixed on the strange man who was still watching me in silence. I didn't see him move an inch. I returned to the cabin, and that night, while I was getting ready to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about the man's words. Although I tried to convince myself it had been an isolated encounter, something inside me told me I should take his warning seriously. The next day, when I went out again, I decided not to approach the forgotten trail anymore. The mountain, no matter how beautiful it was, had stopped being an attractive place for me. While I was moving away, I felt as if the air was lightening a little, as if the atmosphere in that remote corner of Colorado was no longer oppressing me. I never knew what happened to that man, or if his warning had any truth to it. The only thing I know is that sometimes when night falls over the mountains, silence has a different form, and in that silence, something hides. The next day, when I woke up, the sun was already peeking over the mountains, and the light that filtered through the cabin curtains gave me a strange sensation. It was as if the air was still charged with the encounter from the day before. I swallowed, trying to shake off the uneasiness the man had left me with. I tried to think of something logical, something rational. The guy was simply an isolated old man who had let himself be carried away by town stories. Stories that nobody in their right mind would take too seriously, right? But something inside me told me I shouldn't ignore it. The warning kept echoing in my mind. When the sun hides, something awakens. I thought about everything I could do, but in the end, I couldn't find any explanation that made sense. Maybe, as he said, he was just a crazy person. But I couldn't stop wondering what would happen if I disobeyed and returned to the trail. Throughout the day, I kept myself busy. I went to the nearby town and bought some supplies. I approached the square where a couple of men were talking about crops and life in the mountains. I sat on a bench and listened to their stories, looking for something that could give me more context about what I had heard the afternoon before. But curiously, none of them mentioned anything about what the strange man had warned me about. Not even when I asked them about forgotten trails. It seemed the town, for the most part, didn't know anything about that path or the disappearances he mentioned. As evening fell, while I was returning to the cabin, I began to feel the pressure of the day, as if the mountain was watching me. The sky was beginning to take on a soft orange color, and the shadows of the trees lengthened as the sun descended. I remembered the man's words again. When the sun hides, my breathing became heavier as I realized night was approaching quickly. The idea of staying in the cabin seemed more attractive, but at the same time, I felt a kind of compulsion, as if I couldn't ignore the forgotten trail. Curiosity was consuming me. Something in me wanted to test if everything I had heard was nothing more than superstition, or if there really was something behind his words. So when the last glimmer of sun touched the mountain peaks, I decided to leave the cabin and head back to the trail. The light was dim, but it was still enough for me to see where I was walking. I went back into the forest, this time with a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. As I advanced, the air began to feel denser, as if the environment itself was full of heavy stillness. The breeze stopped completely, and the sound of my footsteps on dry leaves became louder and louder, echoing in the silence that surrounded me. The trail was dark. Now, the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch beyond what was natural. An indescribable feeling enveloped me, as if I was crossing an invisible border towards something alien to my understanding. And then, when the sun's light completely disappeared and darkness began to take over the forest, something changed. I couldn't say at what exact moment, but the air turned cold, and I felt something was watching me. Or maybe it was more correct to say something was waiting. My skin crawled, but my body kept going forward. I didn't know why, but I couldn't turn around, as if the trail was absorbing me. Suddenly, in the distance, I heard a creak. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind. It was something different, something heavier footsteps, but not like mine. It was a presence that moved with its own cadence, something I couldn't see, but felt approaching. I couldn't help but turn around, but everything was in shadows. The trees, so tall and straight, seemed to watch me from above, as if they were alive, waiting. My breathing began to accelerate. I remembered the man's words. When you feel it close, it's too late to run. The footsteps were getting closer. Not just the sound, but the presence itself. Something in the darkness was moving toward me, and I could feel its weight, its intention. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the product of suggestion and fear. But every instinct in my body told me to run. And that's exactly what I did. I ran through the forest, stumbling over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I could hear something following, not footsteps anymore, but something bigger, something that moved with purpose through the trees. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of the cabin in the distance. When I finally reached safety, I was gasping, and my clothes were torn from branches. I looked back toward the forest, but saw only darkness. That night, I packed my things. The next morning, I left Colorado without looking back. I never found out what was really in that forest, or if the old man's warning had been real. But sometimes, when night falls and I'm alone, I remember those footsteps in the darkness and wonder if something is still out there, waiting for the next person brave enough or foolish enough to ignore the warning. My name is Andrew, and I'm originally from Galveston. Maybe it doesn't seem like a place where people usually talk about terror, but believe me, there are stories born in places like this, where nature seems to breathe with its own rhythm. However, what I'm going to tell you didn't happen in the hills or in a lonely spot in the middle of the woods. No. This story occurred on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, a paradise that in its apparent tranquility hides something much darker than anyone could imagine. It was late August. The heat of the Gulf Coast felt like a dense, sticky blanket that wouldn't let you breathe. The group of friends I had planned this trip with and I were staying at a small ecolodge near a town forgotten by time. The place was a hidden paradise among the vegetation, surrounded by thick swampland and rivers that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The houses were small, built of wood with palm roofs, and the air was full of that unmistakable mixture of humidity, earth, and wet leaves. There was something mystical about the place, as if you were in the heart of a primitive world untouched by civilization. We, anxious to explore, took a guided excursion with a local man, Felipe, who knew the coastal waters like the back of his hand. During the day, we traveled routes full of abundant fauna and flora. We stopped in front of crystal-clear lagoons and learned about the Cajun culture that had inhabited those lands for centuries. It was fascinating, but something inside me always wanted more. There was a part of me that felt I wasn't living the complete experience if I just followed the group. I needed something more, something of my own, something unique. One afternoon, after lunch, I decided to separate from the group. I wanted to walk alone along a path that disappeared into the marshland and explore a bit more. It wasn't the first time I had done this on other trips, but I had never been so far from home, nor in such a wild environment. I left a note for my friends saying I would return at sunset, but that didn't happen. The trail narrowed as I went deeper into the swamp. The sun was beginning to set, but the shadows among the cypress trees remained dense, almost impenetrable. Each step was followed by the squishing of wet ground under my boots. I felt sweat accumulating on my back, but I was too captivated by the beauty of the place to worry too much about the heat. Here in the middle of nature, hours seemed to vanish as if time had no importance. Little by little, the sound of birds and insects that had filled the air at first began to fade. The swamp, which before seemed so alive, began to become strangely silent. At first I didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just a coincidence, a change in the wind or a natural variation in animal behavior. But soon, a distant noise made me stop dead. It was a low, rhythmic sound, as if someone was walking among the wet leaves, but with very heavy steps. However, I saw nothing, only more trees and vines, the infinite swamp in front of me. At first I thought it was some large animal, maybe an alligator or some black bear. I was about to continue on my way when the noises became clearer. They weren't just footsteps, but a peculiar squelching, as if someone was dragging something through the water, maybe a stick or a thick branch. But the strange thing wasn't just the noise, but that it was approaching. It couldn't be an animal because the sound seemed too directed, as if someone or something that shouldn't be there was walking toward me. My heart began to beat faster, and without thinking too much, I decided to continue forward, walking faster, hoping to find someone from the group or a path to the lodge. But as I advanced, the sound continued, now closer, more persistent. I stopped and looked around. The swamp was so dense I couldn't see beyond a few meters. The sun was already very low, the shadows long and dark, and suddenly a cold breeze ran down my back, something strange in such a hot place. I began to feel pressure in my chest, as if the air had become thicker. The sound was now so close I felt I had it behind me. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. I kept walking, now in panic. Each step seemed heavier, as if the earth itself was resisting me, as if something invisible was slowing my movements. Suddenly I heard a whisper, as if someone was speaking in my ear. I didn't understand the words, but I felt it so close, so real that my skin crawled. I looked back once more. Nothing. The swamp seemed equally dense, equally empty, but then I saw it. A movement among the trees, something dark, a barely visible figure sliding among the shadows. I couldn't distinguish well what it was, but the human outline was clear. It couldn't be one of my friends or Felipe. There was no one else on the trail. Suddenly, as if I had summoned it, the sound became louder. It was a squelching accompanied by heavy steps, as if that figure was approaching quickly. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to flee or stay still, but what I felt at that moment was an urgent need to get out of there. I ran without thinking. My breathing accelerated, my steps sounding too loud in the stillness of the swamp. Behind me, the noises continued, and I felt the presence of something pursuing me, something I couldn't see, but knew was there. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I reached a fork in the trail. In the distance, I saw a light, and my heart jumped when I recognized the lodge. I came out of the swamp panting and with tense muscles. When I got to where my friends were, I told them what had happened, but they looked at me with bewilderment. No one else had heard anything or seen anything. Felipe told me it might have been an alligator or some wild animal, but I knew what I had felt. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't something that could be explained with logic. That night, already in the safety of the lodge, I tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every creak outside the house, every whisper of wind through the trees made me jump. I knew I wasn't alone, and I hadn't been during the entire journey back. Today, months after those days on the Gulf Coast, I still wake up some nights with the feeling that someone is watching me from the darkness. I can't stop thinking about that figure among the trees. I can't stop wondering what it was, and if somehow what I saw or what I felt is still there in the swamp. I don't know if I'll ever return to that place, but I'm sure of something. I wasn't the only one who heard those noises, and I wasn't the only one who felt I wasn't alone. The next day, the island seemed as peaceful as any other on the Gulf Coast. The sun shone brightly, the water was calm, and the sound of waves mixed with the singing of birds. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, but none of us felt at ease. During breakfast, when we were already packing our things, I tried to keep the conversation light, as if nothing that happened the night before had been relevant. But the tension among us was palpable. Robert, as always the most serene, was the first to speak. What we saw last night, I don't know what it was, but it seems to me we should forget it and go back. Here there's nothing more to do. What brought us to the island was fishing, and if we haven't even been able to do that well, we'd better leave. Felipe agreed quickly. Yes, I also feel something isn't right. I don't feel comfortable here, he said while taking a last look at the water. Caesar, for his part, seemed more puzzled than scared. His curiosity had overcome his fear, and although we all tried not to talk about what happened, he couldn't stop asking questions. What do you think that was in the water? I can't stop thinking about it, he insisted while gathering his things. It can't be just a reflection, right? It wasn't something normal. No one responded immediately. The feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was still present. It was then that we decided the best thing was to leave, but the idea of returning to the boat didn't give us peace. Each step we took toward the dock where we had left the boat seemed heavier, more uncomfortable. That silence of the island, although beautiful on its surface, now seemed disturbing to us, as if it hid something none of us wanted to discover. When we finally reached the dock, the boat was just as we had left it, moored with a rope that moved gently to the rhythm of the waves. The four of us got on without saying much, more out of the need to get away than for any other reason. Robert took charge of starting the motor, and little by little we moved away from the island. As we went deeper into the water, the feeling of being safe, of being far from the unknown, began to calm us, but not as much as we would have wished. The return trip was long and silent. No one spoke, and the sun was now almost at its zenith. Hours passed, and the water remained as calm as it had been all morning. However, the tension remained among us. I couldn't help but look back, toward the island, wondering if that figure in the water had been a product of my imagination, or if we had really seen something that had no explanation. I wondered if something was waiting on the island, something we didn't want to know. When we finally arrived at the port of Galveston, Robert was the first to get off the boat. "This place gives me the creeps," he said in a low voice, as if everything that happened on the island was still suspended in the air. Felipe looked at him and nodded without saying anything. Caesar, on the other hand, seemed more thoughtful, as if he was trying to order his thoughts to find a logical answer. We said goodbye quickly, each going his own way. Despite the closeness, none of us wanted to stay too long in the same place. There was something in the air, something that separated us, although no one said it out loud. We had left, but not really. Several days passed before I managed to sleep without thinking about the island. That image of the figure floating in the water remained present like a shadow at the end of my thoughts. During that time, I tried to talk to my friends to see if any of them had had any strange dreams or had felt the same as me. But everyone avoided the topic. No one wanted to remember what happened. The uneasiness accompanied me for weeks. One afternoon, after several weeks of trying to ignore it, I decided to return to Galveston. I needed to understand what had happened. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a need to find answers. So I took the car, drove to the port, and without telling anyone, I boarded a boat to return to the island. The trip was as solitary as the first one. The water seemed bigger, more immense. This time there was no storm, but there was a heaviness in the air, as if the sea knew someone was returning. When the island appeared in front of me, I couldn't help but feel a knot in my stomach. Everything was the same, the golden sand, the ruined wooden cabins, the same landscape. However, the island no longer seemed like a peaceful place to me. Upon landing, I realized that although my friends and I hadn't talked about what happened, I wasn't the only one who had felt something strange. There were no traces of our last stay there. Nothing seemed to have been touched by wind or the passage of time. It was as if everything had been frozen at the moment we left. As if something had stopped time on the island, waiting for us to return. I walked to the place where we had seen the figure, the same cliff that faced the sea. The air was heavy, almost charged, and the sound of the waves didn't have the calm I remembered. It was as if the sea had a different voice, a whisper that called me, that invited me to return, but in a way I didn't understand. I stayed there looking at the ocean without knowing what to expect. The figure, of course, didn't appear, but something else made me turn around. In the distance, in the rocks where we hadn't reached the last time, something was shining. It was a flash, as if something metallic was reflecting the sunlight. Without thinking, I approached, my steps echoing in the silence. I reached the rocks, and what I saw had no logical explanation. There was a box. It was half buried in the sand, as if someone had left it there and covered it to hide it. It wasn't very large, but it had an air of antiquity. The box was rusty and covered with seaweed, but still retained a strange power that made me take it with caution. I opened it carefully, fearing to find something I didn't want to see. Inside, there was something wrapped in cloth. When I unwrapped it, what I found wasn't a treasure or something precious, but something much more disturbing. A wooden mask carved with dark, grotesque details, the kind of mask that in any other circumstances would have been just a curiosity. But there, in the middle of that empty island, and surrounded by the ocean, it seemed something much more sinister. I took it in my hands, and a strange sensation took hold of me. It was clear that this mask belonged to someone, not just because of its antiquity, but because of the way it had been hidden, as if someone wanted to make sure it was never discovered. And then I understood. The island wasn't empty. Maybe it never was. My name is Javier, and I've been ruminating for weeks about everything I experienced during that vacation near the ancient Pueblo ruins in Mesa Verde. I don't know if what happened was a product of the desert heat, fatigue, or if something truly strange occurred in that small hotel near the archaeological site. But what I saw, what I felt, I can't get it out of my head. It was early August when I arrived at that small hotel. My idea was to disconnect for a few days, explore the ancient ruins, and enjoy the peace that in my mind the place would offer me. I was never one to seek saturated tourist destinations, so that small lodge a few blocks from Mesa Verde National Park seemed perfect to me. A quiet place, surrounded by desert landscape, without many tourists, something rustic but with charm. The hotel wasn't very large. It had only a few rooms and was located right at the edge of a road that took you directly to the ruins. The facade was of stone and weathered wood, with a small front garden full of desert plants that seemed to have grown without any order. The reception was in a simple room where the lady who attended me, Mrs. Rosalia, welcomed me with a warm smile, although her eyes, while gentle, seemed to hide something that didn't quite add up for me. It was something in her gaze, as if there was something more behind that facade of kindness. The hotel owner, Don Armando, wasn't there at that moment, but Mrs. Rosalia assured me everything was well prepared for my stay. I paid the cost in advance, as was done in that type of place, and she handed me the key to my room. She also mentioned that breakfast would be served early in the morning, and that if I wanted, I could ask for a light dinner. I don't know why, but something in her tone of voice made me feel uncomfortable. I settled into my room. It was small, with a rustic wooden bed, a chair and table, and a window that faced the hotel garden. I could hear the murmur of leaves moving in the breeze. I decided to go out for a walk around the place, explore the surroundings before going to the ruins the next day. But when I went out, I noticed something curious. Most of the hotel rooms were closed. It was strange because generally in these places there are always at least one or two people around, other tourists or visitors. However, that day only I seemed to be there. As I walked along the path toward the hotel entrance, I crossed paths with a couple of men who were coming from a nearby trail, but I couldn't help but notice they seemed somewhat out of place. Their faces had a seriousness that didn't fit with the typical relaxed expressions of tourists. They greeted Mrs. Rosalia briefly at the reception, and without saying another word, they left walking in silence toward the ruins. Their attitude was strange, as if they were in a hurry to get somewhere, but without hurrying too much. By that time it was already late, and the daylight was beginning to fade, which forced me to return to the hotel. When I entered, I saw that Mrs. Rosalia was no longer at the reception, but the air remained equally heavy, as if something in the place wasn't quite right. That night I had trouble falling asleep. The sheets were a bit rough, and the noise of wind moving the garden leaves made me uneasy. At some point, I got up to go to the bathroom, and that's when something made me stop in front of the window. I saw a shadow moving near the main entrance among the plants, almost as if someone was walking in circles observing the hotel. I decided not to think too much about it and went back to bed, but the uneasiness didn't let me sleep immediately. The next morning, the feeling that something wasn't right intensified. Despite the bright sunlight and the sounds of dawn, there was something in the air that wouldn't let me relax. I went to have breakfast. The hotel dining room was simple, with rustic wooden tables and wrought iron chairs. Mrs. Rosalia served me hot coffee and sweet bread, but I noticed her hands trembled slightly when she handed me the cup. For some reason, I felt watched. While I ate, I heard voices of other people in the patio, but when I looked, there was no one. In fact, the place seemed empty, but the sound persisted, as if the murmurs were coming from somewhere far away, as if someone was observing everything from outside. Throughout my stay, the days began to become stranger. The men I had seen the first day continued appearing during the hours near nightfall. They never spoke to anyone. They just arrived at the hotel, walked toward the garden, and stayed there for a few minutes looking toward the ruins, always with an air of urgency. Of course, I didn't ask anything. I thought they were strange tourists, but something in their behavior seemed out of place to me. One afternoon, while walking toward the ruins, I saw a woman at the hotel entrance. I hadn't seen her before, and curiously, she seemed to be waiting for something. She wore a long dress in dark colors that seemed to clash with the sunny landscape of the area. I looked at her for a few seconds, and she returned my gaze. She didn't smile. She just observed me fixedly as she walked away. It was that night, just after sunset, when I began to hear the murmurs again, but this time much closer. At first I thought they were tourists, but the sound was too low, like a whisper that slid through the wind. I decided to investigate. Following the sound, I headed toward the hotel garden. As I approached, I saw 3 of the men who always came in the afternoon. They were standing next to a small improvised altar in the center of the garden. Something about them was different. They were in silence, motionless, as if they were waiting for something. I approached a little more, and that's when I saw it. A kind of almost human figure hidden behind the plants. A shadow, but not a normal shadow, but something that moved as if it were a person, but it wasn't. It was a mistake to get closer, because at that moment I realized they had noticed me. One of the men looked at me fixedly, and I saw it. I saw him up close. In his eyes there was something that froze my blood. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was something much deeper, something that couldn't be described with words. His face, for a moment, seemed to deform as if it was changing shape. I turned around quickly. My heart was beating hard, and I ran toward the hotel entrance. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being in danger enveloped me completely. The next day, I decided to leave early. Mrs. Rosalia said goodbye to me with a smile, but there was something in her tone that no longer inspired confidence in me. Before leaving, I approached a local store to ask about the hotel. It wasn't common for people in the town to talk much about the place, but I managed to get some answers from an old man who had seen many tourists come and go. He told me the hotel hadn't always been there. It was built a few years ago, and at first the place seemed to have good reviews. However, as more tourists arrived, they began to notice strange things, disappearances, people who came but didn't return. Some talked about the men who always appeared near the hotel. Others mentioned the woman in the dark dress. The truth is that no one knew much more, but he told me something that left me frozen. There were those who said that people who visited the place never left completely. What happened during those days near Mesa Verde, what I experienced, I could never fully understand. Maybe someday, when I return to that place, I'll dare to ask more. But until then, the only thing I know is that sometimes the silence of an ancient place like that can be more dangerous than the noise of the crowd. The days following my departure from the hotel were filled with an uneasiness I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men in the garden, their strange ritual, and especially the deformed face of the one who had looked at me. But what disturbed me most was the feeling that somehow what had happened there wasn't over. A week after my return, I started receiving strange phone calls. They always came at night, around the same time I had witnessed the scene in the garden. When I answered, there was only silence on the other end, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was loaded, as if someone was listening, waiting. At first I thought they were wrong numbers or phone company issues, but the calls became more frequent. Always at the exact same time, always with that heavy silence that seemed to carry an intention I couldn't understand. One night I decided not to answer. The phone kept ringing for almost 10 minutes straight. When it finally stopped, I felt the silence in my apartment had changed. It was denser, more oppressive, as if something had entered with the sound of those rings. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Under my door, someone had slipped a small piece of paper with a symbol drawn on it. The same symbol I had seen carved into the stones of the improvised altar in the hotel garden. It was a spiral intertwined, with lines that seemed to move when you looked at them directly. I kept the paper, not knowing what else to do with it. Part of me wanted to throw it away, but something told me that would be a mistake. That afternoon, I decided to research the symbol online. What I found left me even more disturbed. The symbol appeared in several archaeological sites related to ancient Pueblo cultures, but its meaning was disputed among experts. Some said it was a protection symbol. Others claimed it was used in rituals to communicate with spirits of the dead. But what caught my attention most was a forum post from someone who claimed to have seen the same symbol in a hotel near Mesa Verde. The post was brief, but the description of the place and the strange men matched exactly what I had experienced. The user mentioned that after his stay, he had begun to experience visitations. That's the word he used. He said he felt watched, that he heard whispers in languages he didn't understand, and that sometimes he found objects in his house that he was sure he hadn't put there. I tried to contact the user, but his profile had been deleted. It was as if he had simply vanished from the internet. That night, the phone calls resumed, but this time something was different. Instead of silence, I could hear a faint murmur, like several voices whispering in unison. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost desperate. The calls continued for 3 more nights, each time a little clearer, until finally I could distinguish what they were saying. It was a single word, repeated over and over: return. On the fourth night, the calls stopped. But something else began to happen. I started finding small objects around my house stones with symbols carved into them. Bundles of dried herbs tied with thin rope, small clay figurines that looked like they had been made by ancient hands. I never saw who left them, but each morning there was something new. The objects seemed old, authentic, as if they had been taken from an archaeological site. I began to suspect they were somehow connected to the ruins near the hotel, but I couldn't understand how they were reaching my house, hundreds of miles away. One morning, I found something that made me realize the situation was more serious than I had thought. On my kitchen table, there was an old photograph of the hotel. In the image, I could see the same men I had encountered in the garden, but the photograph looked like it had been taken decades ago. At the bottom, written in faded ink, was a date, 1957. But that was impossible. The old man at the store had told me the hotel had been built just a few years ago. How could there be a photograph from 1957 showing the same place, the same men? I studied the photograph for hours, looking for some sign it was fake, but everything indicated it was authentic. The men in the image were exactly the same as those I had seen, the same faces, the same serious expressions, even the same clothes. It was as if they hadn't aged a day in over 60 years. That night, I made a decision that I knew was probably crazy, but I couldn't continue living with the uncertainty. I was going to return to the hotel. I needed answers, even if I didn't like what I might find. The drive back to Mesa Verde was long and filled with doubts. Part of me hoped to find the place closed, abandoned, or even discover that I had imagined everything. But when I arrived, the hotel was exactly as I had left it. Mrs. Rosalia was at the reception, and she greeted me with the same warm smile, as if she had been expecting me. "I knew you would return," she said before I could even speak. "They always do." The chill that ran down my spine was immediate. There was something in her tone, in the way she looked at me, that confirmed my worst fears. I wasn't just a guest who had decided to return. I was part of something much bigger, something I was only beginning to understand. That night, as I lay in the same room as before, I could hear the murmurs in the garden growing louder. But this time, I didn't go out to investigate. I already knew what I would find there. Instead, I stayed in my room, listening, trying to understand what they wanted from me. As dawn approached, the voices became clearer, and finally I could make out what they were saying. It wasn't English or Spanish, but somehow I understood every word. They were telling me about the ancient ones, about the guardians of the sacred places, about the price that must be paid by those who disturb what should remain undisturbed. And as the sun began to rise over the desert, I finally understood why I had been drawn back to this place, and why those who came here never truly left. The hotel wasn't just near the ancient ruins. It was built on them, and the spirits that had once protected this sacred ground were still here, still watching, still demanding their due from those who dared to trespass on their eternal rest. My name is Javier, and I've been a tour guide for years. I've traveled more places than I can count, but it wasn't until a couple of months ago that I had an experience that left me marked forever. That time, I was with a group of tourists at the famous Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. People usually go there for the underground formations, the spectacular limestone chambers, and the feeling of peace that you breathe. But that day, something changed. It was a late November afternoon. The sun was beginning to lose strength, tinting the sky a reddish tone, and the cold desert breeze was getting more intense. At first, everything seemed normal. The tourists, a small group of 4 people, were excited to tour the caverns and enjoy the underground wonders. They were a couple of families, somewhat older than me, but well disposed to let themselves be surprised by the natural beauty of the place. I greeted them with kindness, as I always do, and we began to descend along the path toward the entrance of the caverns. The route, although somewhat steep, was perfectly safe. It was a very popular tour marked by a well-defined trail. I remember warning them about the small natural obstacles, like slippery stones and roots that protruded from the ground, but nothing out of the ordinary. What happened next was something so unexpected that I still have trouble assimilating it. We reached the entrance to the caverns, a tunnel of rock that extended toward the interior of the mountain. The constant temperature flowed through the tunnel at comfortable levels, and the walls of the cavern, humid and covered with limestone formations, reflected a dim light that came from the lamps placed along the path. My group was fascinated, and while I guided them through the interior of the cavern, I explained the formation of the rocks and how the underground chambers had been carved over millions of years. Nothing that was happening up to that moment seemed out of the ordinary, but as we went deeper into the tunnel, something began to feel strange. It wasn't a noise or a palpable presence, but a sensation in the air, as if suddenly the environment became denser. I didn't want to alarm the tourists, but the temperature began to change. The humidity increased, and although the air remained comfortable due to the natural climate of the caverns, a slight current of cold ran down my back. I moved ahead a few steps to check the route, since we were already approaching a less illuminated zone. It was a section of the tunnel where the formations accumulated, creating small pools, and a little more care was required when walking. What I found stopped me cold. There was something blocking the path. At first I thought it was just a fallen rock, but as I approached I noticed it wasn't something that could be moved easily. It seemed like a kind of large lump covered with dirt and dry formations. At first, I didn't dare touch it. Instinct told me something wasn't right. I decided to return with the group to warn them and see how we would proceed. But when I returned, I noticed something even more disturbing. The lamps that were in the tunnel, the ones that usually illuminated the path constantly, flickered erratically, as if something was interfering with the electrical current. The light became weaker with each flicker, and the tourists began to get restless. I myself tried to maintain calm, but I couldn't deny that something wasn't right. Suddenly, we heard a muffled sound coming from the depths of the tunnel. At first, I thought it could be the sound of water running faster or a rock falling. But as I concentrated a bit more, I realized the sound had an irregular rhythm, as if someone was walking through the tunnel with heavy steps. I looked at the tourists and noticed their faces were beginning to reflect confusion and fear. I hurried to tell them not to worry, that it was probably just the echo of the underground water. But the sound was getting closer and closer. It was no longer just a muffled sound, but it was becoming something much clearer, human footsteps. At that moment, a figure emerged from the darkness at the end of the tunnel. A man, or at least that's what it seemed. He wore dark clothes and his body was covered by a layer of mud, as if he had been rolling on the ground. His face was dirty and his eyes shone in a strange way, as if they reflected the light of the lamps. When I saw his eyes, something inside me shuddered. They weren't human eyes, not entirely. They were empty, as if they lacked emotion or humanity. Before I could react, the man raised his hand, making a strange gesture, and whispered something I couldn't understand. It was a low murmur, something incomprehensible. I felt the air become even denser, and a sensation of discomfort ran through my entire body. The group began to back away slowly, terrified. I did too, unable to take my eyes off that figure that was approaching with firm steps. What followed I can't explain clearly. In the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared into the darkness. He didn't make any jump or sudden movement. He simply vanished as if the air had swallowed his body. The tourists, trembling with fear, looked at me seeking answers. I, for my part, tried to maintain calm. However, a part of me knew that what we had seen couldn't be explained rationally. There was something in that tunnel, something we couldn't understand. I decided to guide them back quickly, without stopping to see what else was on the path. The exit seemed much more distant than I remembered, and the footsteps in the water that previously sounded relaxing now seemed more threatening. Each sound of the water seemed to amplify, and although the lamps continued flickering, I could notice that some areas of the tunnel were completely dark, as if light had never reached there. Finally, we reached the entrance to the caverns, where the light of the sun had already completely vanished, and darkness was beginning to take over the place. None of us said a word during the entire return journey, but we all knew that something strange, something that couldn't be explained, had occurred in that tunnel. When we reached the parking lot, everyone was pale and in complete silence. The tourists said goodbye quickly and left, and although I tried to talk to them, no one wanted to stay longer. I, for my part, also felt uneasy, as if that strange presence still lingered in the air. Since that day, I haven't guided a group through that part of the caverns again. In fact, I no longer dare to go alone. And if someone asks me for a recommendation about Carlsbad Caverns, I always talk to them about the underground formations and the beauty of the place. But I never mention what happened that day. I don't know what that being was or what it was doing there. But what I saw that afternoon left me with the feeling that there are things in the world we're not destined to understand. And although several months have passed since that encounter, I still can't find a logical explanation for what happened. Maybe a man lost in the tunnel or something much darker. I don't know. I only know I never saw the caverns the same way again. The truth is that despite months having passed since that incident in the caverns, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. There were nights when I woke up in cold sweats, remembering those empty eyes that remained engraved in my memory. Who was that man? What was he doing in such a remote place as that? My head wouldn't stop spinning trying to find a logical explanation for what I had experienced. The fact is that, although I tried to ignore it, my work as a tour guide forced me to return to the place. I knew I couldn't let that fear control me, not if I wanted to continue doing what I liked. So months later, I decided to return to the caverns. But this time, I wouldn't go alone, nor would it be with a group of tourists. One January afternoon, I decided I would go with my brother Daniel. He had always accompanied me on several tours, but never in that specific section of the tunnel. I told him in general terms what had happened, but I omitted certain details. I didn't want to scare him more than necessary. Daniel is skeptical, one of those who always try to find a logical explanation for everything. So I hoped that by being there with me, he could disprove anything strange I had imagined. I decided that if we returned to the area where everything had occurred, I could prove to myself that what I experienced was just a product of my mind. We arrived at the caverns around noon, when the place is full of tourists enjoying the underground formations. But that afternoon something was different. The air, although comfortable, carried a touch of strange humidity. I remembered the warning I always gave groups. The climate in the desert can change without warning, and fog can come down quickly. But that morning, the sky was clear. Still, I took the same route I had always traveled with groups, guiding Daniel along the path that descended toward the tunnel. Each step I took on the stones made me remember what I had experienced in that same place. I remembered the first sensations of discomfort, that slight pressure in the air, and that strange alteration that had been felt in the environment. However, at first everything seemed to be calm. The tunnel looked the same. The light from the lamps flickered as always, and the sound of underground water running through the rocks was soft and relaxing. However, as we approached the part where the route bifurcates, something changed again. This bifurcation isn't very common. Most tourists follow the main path that leads directly to the main chambers, but there's a less traveled passage, one that goes a bit deeper into the tunnel, that connects with a more secluded area, with private chambers where you can enjoy a quieter environment. What attracted me most about that place was that although visits were less frequent, access to the site was safe. I decided that this time we would go that way. Let's see how different everything is, I told Daniel. He, as always, accepted without thinking much about it. At first, everything seemed calm. As we advanced through the darker tunnel, the lights that came from the lamps looked increasingly diffuse. But again, that strange sensation, that pressure in the air began to increase. It wasn't something that could be explained, but it was there, like a presence that slipped into the darkest corners of the tunnel. My brother began to notice that the environment was different and asked me if there was something strange in the air. He tried to joke to relax the atmosphere, but I knew he felt the same as me. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the sound of water that normally is constant and relaxing began to change. Sometimes it sounded as if something or someone was walking on the rocks, an irregular tapping that resonated in the tunnel. I looked back, but there was no one else. Must be the echo, I told Daniel, although my voice trembled a bit. Water and rocks create those strange sounds, but I didn't feel convinced. Then, at that same instant, we heard the same sound that had marked our first experience there. Footsteps. This time I didn't ignore them. They were clear footsteps, heavy, but at an irregular rhythm, as if someone was walking with difficulty. I looked at Daniel, who now also looked worried. The air seemed to be heavier. The lights flickered, not just erratically, but some went out completely, leaving sections of the tunnel in darkness. "Did you hear that?" asked my brother, now with a more serious tone of voice. I couldn't respond. I didn't know what to say. We were completely alone in that section of the tunnel, and yet the footsteps kept approaching. The figure appeared again. This time, however, it wasn't a blurry or diffuse figure, but was clearly outlined in the darkness. A thin man, covered in mud, and with the same empty expression in his eyes, that gaze I had seen months before. However, what made me step back wasn't just his appearance, but the fact that this time he didn't vanish into the darkness like the previous time. This time he stayed there, motionless, observing us. My brother, like me, was speechless, staring fixedly at the man. It was as if time had stopped at that moment. There were no screams or violent reactions, just an almost palpable pressure in the air. It was then that the figure slowly raised a hand, pointing at us. His gesture was so inexplicable that it paralyzed me. The silence was absolute, only interrupted by the sound of water moving in the rocks. Then the figure spoke, but it wasn't out loud. It was a whisper, something so low I couldn't understand, just a low murmur that echoed in the stillness of the tunnel. I looked at my brother and saw the same fear reflected in his face. Before I could react, the figure began to slowly retreat, disappearing into the darkness. And with his departure, the environment became lighter, as if the pressure in the air vanished. I didn't understand what had just happened, but I knew we couldn't stay there. I grabbed my brother's arm and began to walk quickly back through the tunnel. I didn't say anything, but I knew he didn't want to stay behind either. When we finally left the tunnel and returned to the open area, the sun had already set and the caverns looked deserted. No one else seemed to be there, just us, trembling with fear. Neither of us said a word on the way back to the car. That night, while driving back home, Daniel asked me if what we had seen was real, if there was any logical explanation. I didn't know what to answer. There was no way to explain it. There was no way to rationalize what had just happened. There was something in that tunnel, something we couldn't understand. And although I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, I knew it wasn't. Since then, I haven't returned to Carlsbad Caverns. Sometimes, I hear stories from other tourists about the place, but I always refrain from telling mine. Who could believe something so strange? What I saw in that tunnel had no logical explanation, and that terrifies me more than anything else. Welcome. Before I begin this story, I'd like to know where you're listening from and what time you prefer to hear these tales. Let me know in the comments. Without further ado, let's begin. My name is Anthony, and although I never thought I'd be able to tell a story like this, today I feel I can no longer keep it to myself. What happened during those days in the Appalachian Mountains continues to haunt my mind like a distant echo that never fades. If I'm here writing this, it's because I need to share it, not just to unburden myself, but because over the years I've tried to find a logical explanation, something that would let me sleep peacefully, but I still haven't found it. 2 years ago, my wife Caroline and I decided to take a break. The city routine, the noise, the stress, it was all consuming us. So after much searching, we found a cabin in the middle of the Appalachian wilderness, an isolated place surrounded by mountains and forests, far from any form of civilization. We thought it would be the perfect escape. What could go wrong in such a peaceful place, surrounded only by nature? We drove there in our car, a long but pleasant journey. The landscape changed as we approached, from farmland to thick pine forests. During the drive, we saw no one. The roads became narrower and narrower, and we began to feel as if we were entering a completely unknown place. When we arrived at the cabin, the sun was already setting. It was a rustic wooden construction with large windows facing the forest. The place had a peculiar charm, but there was a calmness in the air that, while refreshing, also seemed too dense. After a couple of hours settling in, we decided to go out and explore the surroundings a bit before it got completely dark. The cabin was located on the banks of a small river with a trail that led into the forest. We decided to follow that path for a few minutes. Everything was silent. Only the sound of our footsteps on dry leaves and the distant singing of some birds accompanied our walk. When we returned, it was almost night. The fresh mountain air had a different touch, something I couldn't describe exactly, but it felt different from everything we knew. That night, we had dinner by candlelight. There was no electricity in the cabin, only the gas lamp hanging from the ceiling. Caroline was a little quieter than usual, but I attributed it to the fatigue of the trip. After dinner, we settled in the living room reading a bit when night finally closed completely. The sound of wind in the trees outside the cabin became more pronounced, and the occasional creaking of wood seemed to echo throughout the place. It was just as we were about to go to sleep when I noticed something strange. From the window, I saw there was something in the mud in front of the door. Some footprints. They weren't normal, they were large, deep, and had an irregular shape. At first I thought some animal had passed by, maybe a deer or a wild boar. But something about them didn't convince me. I approached the door and observed carefully. The footprints seemed to follow a pattern, as if something had left them with intention. The most disturbing thing of all was that they seemed to lead toward the cabin and then fade away, as if the creature that had left them had vanished into thin air. I showed the footprints to Caroline, but she seemed unimpressed, even a bit puzzled by my insistence on continuing to observe them. "It's just an animal," she said with a nervous smile. "Don't worry." But I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. Something wasn't right. We locked the door and went to sleep. That night, sleep was interrupted by strange noises coming from outside. At first I thought they were animals, but the sounds were too loud, as if something large was moving among the trees. I got up and looked out the window, but I saw nothing. However, the wind had completely ceased, and the silence was so absolute that I found it disturbing. I decided to go back to sleep, although the feeling that someone or something was watching us didn't leave me in peace. The next morning, when I opened the door to go out, the footprints were still there. But now there was something more, a kind of drag mark in the mud, as if something heavy had passed through there, leaving a deep mark that wound to the edge of the river. I decided to follow the footprints without telling Caroline anything. I walked along the path that led to the river, but the footprints faded before reaching the water. Something didn't make sense, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The afternoon passed slowly with Caroline and me talking about anything to distract ourselves. But I kept looking at the forest, wondering what could have left those footprints. When the sun began to hide behind the mountains, I felt compelled to go to the door again. This time I saw something that made my skin crawl. In the mud near the door, there was a small object, like a smooth stone, but on its surface it had an engraved strange symbol, something I had never seen before and couldn't identify. I decided to keep it in my backpack, without telling Caroline anything. That night again the noises returned. This time they were closer, as if someone was walking around the cabin. The creaking of branches and the tapping against the wooden walls intensified. I decided to check the windows, but everything seemed calm. When I returned to my bed, I couldn't help but hear soft footsteps in the hallway, as if someone was walking through the cabin. I got up, but there was nothing, only darkness. Dawn came with absolute stillness. At 3 a.m, Caroline woke up startled. "Anthony, are you there?" she said, her voice trembling. I got up immediately, worried, but she was looking at me with wide eyes, as if she had seen something. I heard something, as if someone was in the room. That night I finally couldn't fall asleep. The pressure on my shoulders, the discomfort I felt tormented me. At dawn, we decided to abandon the cabin, but before leaving, I looked again at the mud in front of the door. The footprints, the marks, everything had disappeared. Only clean ground remained, with no signs of anything. Back home, I tried to leave everything that happened behind, but the feeling of uneasiness hasn't left me in peace since then. I don't know if what I experienced in the Appalachians was a product of my mind, of isolation, or if something strange really had stalked that cabin. What I do know is that those footprints and that symbol on the stone continue to haunt my thoughts, and I never found a reasonable explanation. What had left those footprints? Why did they fade without a trace? And what did the symbol mean? I don't know, but something tells me I'll never know, and that somewhere in the forest, the footprints are still there waiting to be discovered by someone else. 2 years have passed since we left the cabin in the Appalachians behind. And although I've tried to continue with my life as if nothing had happened, something inside me refuses to let go of that experience. The uneasiness I felt during those days still haunts me, and I can't help but wonder if what happened was really just a product of my mind altered by isolation, or if there was something more at play, something I couldn't understand at the time. After returning to the city, I tried to talk to Caroline about what happened, but she seemed to have left it behind quickly, as if what occurred in the cabin was just a series of coincidences and nothing more. She kept insisting that everything we had experienced could be explained rationally. The noises, the footprints, the strange sensations, everything had a logical explanation. But for me, it wasn't that simple. In the following days, I tried to search for information about the Appalachians, about the nearby towns, and about possible strange phenomena that could explain what I had experienced. But all I found was the same as always: stories about the landscape, about the flora and fauna of the place, and even some legends about the region, but nothing that fit what we had experienced. Most of those stories talked about spirits of nature, but I didn't believe in that kind of thing. My mind was trapped between the rational and the inexplicable. Shortly after returning, I couldn't stop thinking about the stone with the strange symbol I had found near the footprints. Although it wasn't a particularly striking piece, the feeling it gave me when I held it was unmistakable. That stone, that mark, something wasn't right about it. I couldn't stop wondering why it was there, why it had appeared just at that moment, and what meaning it had. The worst part was that I couldn't find a single clue to help me unravel its origin. One day, while browsing the internet, I found an online forum where some travelers shared their experiences in the Appalachians. In that forum, a man told a story very similar to ours, although his account wasn't as detailed. He talked about an isolated cabin in a remote place in the mountains, strange footprints in the mud, and a feeling of being watched during the night. But what caught my attention most was the comment that followed the story. An anonymous user mentioned something about an ancient symbol that could be found in various parts of the region. A symbol that, according to him, had a connection with an ancient cult that had existed in the mountains. This cult, according to the comment, had been known for its dark rituals related to nature and forest protection. However, there was no clear evidence of its existence, and many of the stories were more legends that had been passed down from generation to generation. That mention of the symbol made my hair stand on end. Could it be that the symbol I found on the stone was related to all this? Could there be something deeper in the events of that night than I had thought? I decided to write to the user who had left the comment. My message was brief, without going into too much detail, and I asked about the symbol and about the history of the cult. The response came a few days later, and what it said left me perplexed. The man told me that the symbol was known in the region, but few knew its true meaning. According to him, this symbol was associated with ancient protection rituals that the original inhabitants of the mountains performed to keep certain mountain entities at bay. He explained that in some accounts, there was talk of footprints that appeared in mud in places where these entities approached, but they never let themselves be seen. The description he made of those beings made me shudder, creatures that walked in silence, that vanished as quickly as they appeared, and that left marks on the ground as a warning. I received that response with a knot in my stomach. Although I tried to rationalize it, something inside me said there was some truth in what I read. The next day, Caroline and I discussed all this. She didn't understand why I couldn't let go of what happened, why I insisted on continuing to look for answers. "It's over, Anthony," she told me in a calm but firm tone. "We can't keep tormenting ourselves over something that has no explanation." However, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had experienced in the mountains wasn't simply a set of coincidences. The uneasiness was devouring me. I decided to make a decision that had been haunting me since we returned to go back to the Appalachians, this time without Caroline. I needed to close this chapter of my life, face what had happened, and if possible, understand it. Over time, I planned another trip. I didn't tell Caroline my intentions. I knew she wouldn't understand. The idea of returning to the same cabin, to the same place where I had experienced those strange sensations, terrified me, but also attracted me. I felt I needed to know more, that I needed to get answers, even if they were terrifying. When I arrived in the region, the landscape hadn't changed. The mountains remained as majestic and quiet as always, but there was something different, something heavier in the air. The cabin apparently remained the same. No one had been there all that time. As I approached, the feeling of familiarity invaded me, but also that of latent danger, something that was waiting for me, something that had been lurking since the first time I was there. 3 days passed without anything out of the ordinary happening. I returned to tour the surroundings, observing everything carefully, trying to find some clue that could explain everything. And then, on the 4th day, when I was about to go out to explore once more, I saw it. In front of the door, in the mud, the footprints were there again. There was no doubt they were the same ones I had seen that first night. And not only that, this time there was something more. In the same place where I had found the stone with the symbol, now there was a kind of small improvised altar composed of stones and branches, with the same symbol carved on the central stone. A chill ran through my body. I knew something was wrong. I had been looking for answers, but now the questions multiplied. Why were those footprints still there? What did all that mean? Who had left that altar? I couldn't stay there. Something inside me said the danger was real, that I was playing with forces I didn't understand, that I shouldn't keep looking, but it was too late. My name is Hector, and I'm a writer. It's not the first time I've come to Louisiana, but what happened on this occasion would forever change my way of seeing the world. What I'll tell you happened a couple of years ago. During a vacation, I took seeking inspiration for my next book. I decided to get away from the noise of the city and spend some time in a small town among the bayous, a place apart from everything. What I didn't know was that what I was looking for there would be something I should never have found. The town was called Rose Creek, a place with barely a few dirt streets, surrounded by sugarcane fields and ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. As soon as I arrived, the tranquility that was breathed in the air enveloped me. That deep calm that makes you feel like time stops. At first, the atmosphere seemed charming to me. The people were warm, always willing to help, to offer you a smile. The houses with tin roofs and weathered wooden walls had a picturesque air, and the dusty streets seemed taken from an old dream. I stayed at a small inn run by an older lady named Miss Rosa. She was a sweet woman with a laugh that resonated throughout the place. Her hospitality was such that it didn't take long for me to feel at home. The first day she offered me coffee from her own plantation and showed me the only store in town where they sold everything from fresh biscuits to local crafts. During the first weeks, everything was perfect. The days passed between walks along the country roads, conversations with the locals, and nights when I sat in front of the fireplace to write. However, something began to make me uncomfortable. It wasn't anything tangible at first, just a slight sensation that everything wasn't as well as it seemed. It was in the looks of the inhabitants, in their half-closed smiles, in how they always knew what to do or say in each situation, as if they knew everything about me without even asking. One afternoon, while walking through the town, I stopped at a small central square. There was a stone fountain in the center covered with moss and lichens, and around it rose several wooden houses with balconies full of plants. I approached an older man who was sitting on a bench smoking a cigarette and asked him to tell me something about the history of the place. He told me that Rose Creek was an old town founded in colonial times, but that actually its history wasn't so simple. "This town has secrets, young man," he told me in a grave tone without looking me in the eyes. "There are things that shouldn't be asked about, things that should stay in the past." Those words made me uneasy, but I didn't give them too much importance. I continued on my way, but that warning remained engraved in my mind. I decided to investigate a little more about the town's history, but the few books I found in the store only talked about superficial things, about the founding and agricultural growth. What seemed most intriguing was the people. There was something strange in their way of life, something I found difficult to identify. One night, while having dinner at Miss Rose's inn, I heard two men talking at the next table. They mentioned a name, Aunt Soledad. I couldn't help but listen, and when one of them noticed my curiosity, he leaned toward me and in a low voice said, "It's better that you don't get into that, young man. Aunt Soledad is dead, but she isn't. Her story isn't told. Nobody talks about her." I was left with the intrigue. Something inside me wanted to know more. And as a writer, the temptation to discover something hidden, something that could serve as inspiration, was too strong. That night after Miss Rosa retired to sleep, I decided to go out for a walk through the town. At those hours, everything was in complete silence. The houses seemed asleep, but something heavy floated in the air, as if the town breathed at a different rhythm. I headed toward Aunt Soledad's house. No one had given me an exact address, but following the small clues I had heard, I arrived at a solitary house at the end of town, right where the road began to enter the swamp. The house was half in ruins, with adobe walls covered in moss and boarded-up windows. There were no signs of life, but something in the atmosphere made me think there could still be someone there. I decided to approach. The door was closed with a rusty padlock, but in a corner of the yard, I found a broken window through which I could enter. I slipped through it carefully. The cool night air froze my skin as I advanced toward the interior. The place was dark, and the dust on the floor seemed not to have moved in years. As my eyes got used to the darkness, I began to see disturbing details: old portraits of women on the walls, melted candles in corners, and an old wooden chair next to a dining table covered in dust. Suddenly, something made the floor creak upstairs. I stopped. My heart began to beat hard. I knew I wasn't alone. I thought about running away, but curiosity pushed me to go up the stairs. I climbed cautiously, but there was nothing there, just a closed door at the end of the hallway. I took a deep breath and approached the door, which opened with a slight squeak. Inside, I found a room that seemed frozen in time. On the table, there were several scattered papers, and on the wall, a large framed photo of a woman with a penetrating gaze. At the bottom of the photo it read, "Soledad Sanchez, Aunt Soledad." The air in the room was dense, as if something in it was about to collapse. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, leaving me trapped in the darkness. I tried to open it, but something or someone from the other side prevented it. I heard soft breathing, as if someone was waiting, watching. At that moment, I understood that Aunt Soledad's story wasn't something the town wanted me to know. It wasn't a ghost story, but something much more sinister, something that had been happening in that place for generations. The door finally opened, and I ran out of the house. When I got to the inn, I found Miss Rosa waiting for me, as if she had known everything that had happened. "I told you not to ask," she told me, her voice now grave and serious. "The town has a price for its secrets." From that night on, Rose Creek became even more disturbing for me. It wasn't just the warmth of its inhabitants that made me uncomfortable, but the fact that everything in that place was covered by a layer of silence. I never asked about Aunt Soledad again, nor tried to discover more about the town's past, but the feeling that I had touched something dangerous never disappeared. Today I still visit Louisiana, but I never approached Rose Creek again. And although I try to forget it, I know there are things that time doesn't erase, things that should have stayed buried forever. Several months passed since I left Rose Creek. My stay in the town remained as a mark in my memory, but what happened afterward during my return to the city was what really left me breathless. I was determined to leave what happened behind, to concentrate on my work and forget about those days in the town. But the traces that Rose Creek left began to pursue me in ways I couldn't anticipate. When I returned to the city, I tried to continue with my writing, but something wasn't working. My nights filled with insomnia, and in my mind, the faces of the town's people kept appearing. The friendly faces that before made me feel welcome, but now seemed charged with inexplicable tension. The image of Aunt Soledad, the woman from the photo I saw in the house, repeated itself over and over. Something in her gaze, something in that photo, wouldn't stop disturbing me. There was something more behind that woman, something that wouldn't let me stop thinking about her. It was then that I started receiving letters. At first I thought they were simple fan letters, people who followed me on social media or readers of my books. However, I soon realized that wasn't the case. The first letters seemed harmless, but as the days progressed, the words began to change. They were handwritten with handwriting that, although clear, had a touch of urgency. At first they seemed harmless to me, but soon they began to mention things I didn't understand. "I know what you discovered in Rose Creek," said one. "The town won't let you go so easily." There was another that left me frozen. "Aunt Soledad is looking for you. She won't forget you." I tried to ignore them, throwing them away, but the tone of the letters put me on alert. No one else knew what had happened there. How was it possible that someone knew what I had done in the town? It was no longer just a vague sensation, but a presence that watched me, that stalked me from the shadows. One day, while I was in the office reviewing a draft of my next book, I received a call. At first I didn't answer, since I didn't recognize the number, but something inside me pushed me to do it. When I picked up, "Do you remember me?" the voice asked. "You shouldn't have asked about her. Aunt Soledad won't let you go." I was paralyzed. I tried to respond, but the call was cut off abruptly. The air in the room became heavier and heavier, as if the space was full of an invisible presence. I looked for the number on my phone, but when I tried to return the call, I realized it didn't exist. A chill ran down my spine, although I promised myself that what had just happened was only a product of my mind, of fatigue, of the paranoia that had grown in me due to the letters. What followed was even more disturbing. That same night when I got home, I found a box at the entrance. There was no sender or name, just an address written by hand. I opened the box cautiously. Inside was an old rag doll with sewn eyes and a faded dress. The strange thing was that in her hand, she carried a small crumpled paper, as if someone had left a message on it. When I unfolded the paper, I found a few words written with ink that seemed darker than normal. "She knows you were there. Rose Creek always claims those who dare to look back." My skin crawled. What did this mean? What kind of game was someone playing with me? And why the doll? The night became a labyrinth of thoughts and fears. Every creak of the windows, every whisper of the wind seemed like a threat to me. I slept little that night, and the next day, after finding the doll in my living room, I decided I had to return to Rose Creek to face whatever was happening. Maybe there was something in that town that I couldn't understand, and that was somehow following me. The worst of all was that I couldn't stop thinking about Aunt Soledad. In that silent figure that seemed to have crossed the line between past and present. The trip to Rose Creek was short, but every mile I traveled, I felt more uneasy. The memories of the town filled me with a strange sensation, as if I wasn't returning to a familiar place, but to a site where I no longer belonged. When I finally arrived, the atmosphere in the town was the same. I remembered the absolute tranquility, the smiles of the inhabitants, the houses in their state of unaltered calm. But something had changed, something in the air that made me feel I wasn't welcome. I went directly to Miss Rose's house, but when I arrived, the door was closed. No one answered my knocks. I decided to go to the town store, the only place where I could get some information. The store owner, An older man named Don Martin looked at me cautiously when I asked about Miss Rosa. "She's not around here anymore," he responded, his tone evasive. "She left some time ago, nobody knows where." I decided to go to the place where I had seen Aunt Soledad's house. But when I arrived, something even stranger occurred. The house was no longer there. The land was empty, without traces of its existence. I looked around trying to understand what had happened, but there were no signs that anything had been there. The place was just a piece of land in the middle of nowhere. It was then that I began to hear murmurs behind me. I turned, but saw no one. The murmurs seemed to come from everywhere, as if the entire town was talking among themselves, but no one was addressing me. Everything seemed normal, and at the same time stranger and stranger. Without wanting to, I had returned to the same point from where I had started. Rose Creek hadn't forgotten me or let me go. And the worst part was that now I understood what the man in the square had told me that afternoon. This town has secrets, young man, things that shouldn't be asked about. I was no longer just a writer looking for inspiration. Now I was part of a story I should never have begun to investigate. Aunt Soledad, her shadows, and the town were watching me. And I don't know if I'll ever stop hearing those murmurs in my head. I was finishing my 4th consecutive shift when I received the message. It was from the coordination office of a contracted company that usually covers emergencies at nursing homes and long-term care facilities. They said it was just to help out for that night shift. A patient needing supervision and routine medications. Easy money. The location wasn't far, but the drive already made me uncomfortable. It was a dirt road near Bakersfield, California, surrounded by hills on both sides with no cell signal for the last 2 miles. The facility's gate was iron, tall, and locked with a heavy padlock. I had to honk with my headlights on for almost 2 minutes before someone appeared. The woman who opened the gate didn't introduce herself, just said she was the coordinator. She seemed rushed, and the way she looked at me made something freeze inside me. You know when someone evaluates you like they're measuring whether you're going to cause problems or not. She told me, "Just stay calm, everything's already prepared, just follow what's on the labels." She pointed to a cooler with pre-filled syringes. Right there, I should have left. But we're healthcare workers, you know. There's something wrong everywhere. You learn to take a deep breath, do your job, and leave with a clean conscience. Except this time, that conscience didn't come back with me. The facility looked like a renovated ranch, but poorly finished. Uneven floors, the smell of cleaning products too strong, and an improvised reception with a plastic table and an old notebook as a sign-in sheet. There was no computer, no patient files, no internet signal. Patient names were handwritten on copy paper clipped together. Just names, nothing else, no age, no medical history, no continuous medication notes. I was introduced to the aide who would stay with me. A quiet young man with downcast eyes. He just showed me the rooms. 3 rooms with 2 beds each, 5 elderly patients. The 6th was expected to arrive during the night. All the residents were sedated, no television, no radio, no visitors. I approached the first patient, a frail elderly woman with very thin, marked skin. She was breathing with difficulty. I went to get the pulse oximeter. Nothing, not even a thermometer, just a tray with needles, cotton, and an expired bottle of alcohol. At midnight, I went to prepare what was supposed to be routine medication. I started checking the labels and noticed something was strange. One of the vials claimed to be a common sedative, but the name didn't match. It was an old name I had read about in news reports as being banned by the FDA for serious adverse effects. I checked the expiration date. It was still valid, but the origin was questionable. No national manufacturer, no traceable lot number. I took a hidden photo and thought, I'll save this in case I need to prove something later. At 1:50 in the morning, an unmarked ambulance stopped at the door. Nobody announced anything, they just honked. The aide ran out and in less than 2 minutes came back pushing a gurney. It was a woman of approximately 70 years old. She had no identification bracelet, no documentation, but already had an IV access in her arm. And more importantly, she had heavy makeup on her face, as if someone wanted to hide something. She was unconscious, shallow breathing, strange neck position. The hospital gown was loose, but you could see old purple bruises on her arm and shoulder. When I approached to assess her, I noticed something else that chilled me. She had a small tattoo on the inside of her forearm, a name probably hers, but someone had passed foundation over it and very poorly applied. I did what any professional would do. I checked vital signs, wrote everything down on my own paper, but I didn't register it in the facility's notebook. There was nowhere to do so. I went to the landline phone, the only means of contact. I called the coordinator. She answered immediately, as if she was waiting, and just said, "Do everything according to the label. No need to ask questions, it's just one night." That hit me differently. I hung up and thought, I'm not on a shift. I've walked into something. I continued through the night pretending to be calm. At 3:30, the new woman started to get agitated. She tried to say something, but her voice wouldn't come out. She pointed to her neck as if she had pain or difficulty swallowing. I went to get the emergency medication. It was in a separate box with letters stuck on with electrical tape. When I opened it, I realized it was the same sedative as the first patient, just with another label on top, a fake label. By this time, the aide had already disappeared from the facility. The woman remained in a semi-conscious state until about 4:30, then fell asleep. But I'll never forget that look, and the worst was yet to come. When the sun began to rise, I prepared to hand over the shift, but when I tried to open the gate, it was locked from the outside, padlocked again, without a key. I walked around the facility, tried to exit through the back, nothing. At exactly 6 o'clock, the same coordinator appeared with fresh lipstick and sunglasses. She entered smiling, as if nothing had happened. She handed me an envelope with cash payment and said, "See how easy it was. You just have to know how to behave." "Want to come back next week?" I said yes. But as soon as I stepped onto the asphalt, in the stretch with cell signal, I blocked that number and never responded to anything again. The following Monday, I tried to write down the address to report it, but then came the detail that will never leave my head. The facility was no longer there. I returned to the exact address 2 days later. It was Monday, around 3 in the afternoon. I wanted to take photos of the facade, get the street name for sure, to file a complaint report, even if it was anonymous. But when I got there, it was just brush. Brush and an empty lot, with recent tire marks and some broken tiles in the corner, as if someone had dismantled everything in a hurry. The fence was still there, but the gate was no longer the same. And at the entrance, there was a crooked sign that read "For rent" with a disconnected phone number. I got in the car and sat there for about 5 minutes with the engine off, listening to the sound of the hills. The feeling was that it had never existed. No ambulance, no patient, no shift. But I still had the photos, not many, because I took them hidden, but enough to prove I was there. One of the images shows the counter where the medications were, with a vial in hand, and the lot number partially visible. I thought about sending it to the state medical board or even the press. But then I stopped, because I also thought, if what happened to me is part of a larger operation, who guarantees that reporting would be safe? If the facility disappeared, if the coordinator's number became non-existent, if there wasn't even a patient file, who would believe me? And worse yet, who would protect me? I spent the following weeks with my phone on silent. I slept with it under my pillow. I even changed the route I took home. I didn't tell what had happened even to my wife. Actually, until now, I've never told this to anyone. These days, I still work in healthcare, but I only accept shifts in hospitals where I know someone from the permanent staff, and I avoid any unit that doesn't have a digital system or camera surveillance. The truth is that what I saw that night broke me in a place that doesn't heal. It wasn't just the use of banned medication, or just the lack of structure, or the way the patients were drugged. It was the fact that everyone was acting as if it were normal, as if hiding tattoos with makeup, as if delivering patients without names, as if sealing a box of syringes without origin were part of the process. And the worst part is that I went in, I administered medications, I wrote on paper. I kept my head down and pretended everything was fine. Because in that place, at that moment, I understood something that gave me chills. If I had made any wrong move, if I had questioned out loud, I wouldn't have gotten out. When the coordinator looked at me that morning and said with that smile that didn't move her eyes, "See how easy it was. You just have to know how to behave," I understood that she wasn't reassuring me, she was warning me. It was that or not getting out of there, and that's why I stayed quiet. Time passed. I tried to forget, but the image of that woman on the gurney, the arm with hematomas, the poorly hidden tattoo, the lost look, she appears to me sometimes out of nowhere. And when she appears, I think, is she still alive? Was she someone missing? Did someone from the family look for her and never get an answer? Maybe she's not even among us anymore. And if that's the case, the worst part is knowing that I helped even without wanting to, because I stayed quiet and because I let it happen. This was a report sent to the Terror Diary channel. If you work in healthcare and have been through something similar or still carry something you never had the courage to tell, this space is yours too. We give voice to those who saw what they shouldn't have and survived to tell about it. My name is Alex, and I want to share something that happened to me and my wife Sarah just last month. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything you think you know about time and reality. Even now, weeks later, I'm not entirely sure what we experienced that night. It was a Tuesday evening, around 8 o'clock, when Sarah and I decided to grab some dinner. We'd both had long days at work, and neither of us felt like cooking. Our usual routine was to hit up the convenience store on Maple Street for some quick snacks and drinks, then maybe order pizza when we got home. The store was only about 10 minutes from our house, in a quiet residential neighborhood that we'd driven through hundreds of times. We knew every street, every house, every landmark. It was as familiar to us as our own backyard. But that night, something was different. As we pulled into the parking lot of the convenience store, we immediately noticed that the entire street was blocked off. There was a massive block party in full swing. The kind of neighborhood celebration you might see during a summer festival or 4th of July weekend. The whole street was filled with people, music, and activities. There were at least 3 large bounce houses set up in the middle of the road, each one packed with kids jumping and laughing. A DJ had set up a huge sound system on someone's front lawn, and the music was loud enough to be heard from several blocks away. The bass was thumping so hard that we could feel it vibrating through our car. Food trucks were parked along both sides of the street, serving everything from barbecue to funnel cakes. The smell of grilled meat and fried foods wafted through our open car windows. There were families everywhere, parents chatting while keeping an eye on their kids, teenagers hanging out in groups, elderly couples sitting in lawn chairs and watching the festivities. Sarah and I looked at each other in amazement. "How do we not hear about this?" she asked. "This is huge." I shrugged. Maybe it's a last-minute thing, or maybe we just haven't been paying attention to the neighborhood newsletter. The party looked like it had been going on for hours. People were settled in with their chairs and coolers. Kids were running around with their faces painted, and there was even a small stage set up where local musicians were performing. It was the kind of community event that takes weeks to plan and coordinate. We parked at the edge of the blocked-off area and walked into the convenience store. The cashier, a young guy named Marcus, who we'd seen dozens of times before, was working behind the counter as usual. "Hey there," I said as we walked in. "Quite a party going on out there." Marcus looked up from his magazine and smiled. "Yeah, it's been like this all day. Started around noon, I think. The whole neighborhood really came together for this one." We spent about 20 minutes in the store, picking out snacks and drinks, chatting with Marcus about the party and how great it was to see the community so active. The music was still pumping outside, and through the store windows, we could see people dancing and having a great time. When we finished shopping and headed back to our car, I was already thinking about how we might participate in next year's block party. Maybe we could volunteer to help with setup or donate some food for the event. It was exactly the kind of neighborhood spirit that had drawn us to this area in the first place. But when we stepped outside, the street was completely empty. Not just quiet, empty. There were no bounce houses, no DJ, no food trucks, no families. The street was back to its normal state, with cars parked along the curbs and porch lights glowing in the evening darkness. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Sarah and I stood there for a moment, completely stunned. We looked at each other, then back at the street, then at each other again. "Where did everyone go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I walked to the middle of the street, where the largest bounce house had been just minutes before. The asphalt was completely normal, no indentations, no marks, no evidence that anything heavy had been sitting there. I knelt down and ran my hand over the surface. It was cool to the touch, not warm as it should have been if dozens of people had been dancing on it just moments before. "This doesn't make sense," I said, standing up and looking around. There were hundreds of people here. Where could they all have gone so quickly? We walked up and down the street, looking for any sign of the party. No forgotten cups or napkins, no pieces of decorations, no tire tracks from the food trucks. It was as if the entire event had never happened. Feeling confused and a little desperate for answers, we went back into the convenience store. Marcus was still behind the counter, reading the same magazine. "Hey, Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "What happened to the party outside? Did it end early?" He looked up with a confused expression. "What party? I've been here since 2 o'clock and there hasn't been any party." "But you just told us about it 20 minutes ago," Sarah said. "You said it had been going on all day." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I think you might be confused. I've been here all afternoon and it's been quiet the whole time. No parties, no music, nothing unusual." We left the store feeling completely disoriented. The drive home was silent as we both tried to process what had just happened. Had we somehow hallucinated the entire thing? Had we both had some kind of shared delusion? It didn't seem possible, but what other explanation was there? That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of them. The party had been so real, so detailed. I could still smell the barbecue, still hear the music, still see the kids playing in the bounce houses. It wasn't the kind of thing you could just imagine. The next morning, I decided to do some investigating. I drove back to the neighborhood and knocked on a few doors, asking residents if they'd heard about any block parties or community events. Everyone I talked to gave me the same answer. There had been no party, no event, nothing unusual happening on their street. But then, exactly 1 week later, something incredible happened. Sarah and I were driving past the same convenience store when we saw it, the exact same block party, in the exact same location, with the exact same setup. The bounce houses were in identical positions. The DJ was playing the same music. Even the food trucks were parked in the same spots. We pulled over and stared in amazement. It was like déjà vu, but more intense. Everything was exactly as we remembered it from the week before. "Are we losing our minds?" Sarah asked. I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that somehow, someway, we had witnessed something that hadn't happened yet. We had seen the future, or stepped into some kind of time loop, or experienced something that science couldn't explain. This time we didn't go into the store. We just sat in our car and watched the party, trying to understand what we were seeing. After about an hour, we drove home, our minds buzzing with questions that we couldn't answer. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe time isn't as linear as we think it is. Maybe there are moments when the future bleeds through into the present, giving us glimpses of what's to come. Or maybe there are places where reality is thinner, where the impossible becomes possible. All I know is that we saw something that hadn't happened yet, and then we saw it happen exactly as we remembered it. It changed the way I think about time, about reality, about the nature of existence itself. And every time I drive past that convenience store, I wonder if I might catch another glimpse of something that hasn't happened yet, or something that's happening in a different version of now. My name is Isaac, and I've been hunting in the most remote corners of the Sierra Nevada mountains my entire life. Hunting has always been more than a hobby for me. From a young age, I was taught to respect nature, but also to be very aware of the dangers it brings. The deep silence of the forests, the stillness of solitary clearings have a beauty that's hard to describe. but at the same time, an aura of danger I've never underestimated. It was a day in late autumn when the air was already becoming sharp, and fallen leaves covered the ground with a golden blanket. I found myself in a place known as Devil's Chair, an isolated location in the Sierra Nevada range. Nobody went there except some hunters like me, who knew that's where the best game could be found. It wasn't an easily accessible place, and that's why I preferred to go alone. I didn't like groups. Solitude gave me peace and concentration. That morning, I climbed up a steep route. The sun rose slowly between the mountains, filtering pale rays through the bare branches of the trees. The sound of my breathing and the crunching of dry leaves under my boots were my only companions. I had been walking for several hours when I reached a clearing in the forest, a small open space where the vegetation was less dense. I looked around searching for any movement, any sign of an animal. I saw it first in the distance, a deer moving with the grace typical of these animals. The wind blew gently in my face, and with it, I could make sure my scent wouldn't reach it. There was no sound other than the whisper of branches moving. The deer was about 200 yards away, far enough for a good shot if I positioned myself well. I crouched slowly, adjusted the scope of my rifle, and with a deep breath squeezed the trigger. The roar of the shot echoed in the air, followed by absolute silence. I looked at the place where the animal had fallen, but I saw nothing. Instead of the deer, something else caught my attention. About 100 yards away, in a clearing that normally went unnoticed, something lay stretched on the ground. At first I thought it was a log or one of the branches fallen by the wind, but something about its shape made me doubt. I stood up and began to walk toward it, my boots sinking into the wet ground, while an uncomfortable sensation was taking hold of me. As I got closer, my steps became slower. What I initially thought was a log now clearly looked like a human body. A man was lying face down, with his arms extended and his clothes torn. His face was covered by his hair, but I didn't need to see it. The smell of decomposition was clear enough to make me realize he had been there for a while. I stood paralyzed. Something didn't add up. What was a corpse doing here in the middle of such a remote clearing? The nearest towns were several hours' walk away, and the idea that someone had been lost and arrived so far seemed unlikely to me. I crouched cautiously, observing the details. The man's clothing was old, but didn't seem like someone who lived in the mountains. There were remains of something else, maybe blood, staining the earth. I didn't want to touch anything. I looked around searching for some sign that this was part of an accident or something else. There were no footprints or signs of struggle, nothing. I got up slowly, feeling an uncomfortable pressure taking hold of me. I couldn't stay there. It wasn't my place to investigate this kind of thing. However, before turning around, something made me look at the body again. A slight movement. It was imperceptible at first, but I saw it. Something moved, a small tremor in his arm, as if the body still had some life. Fear took hold of me instantly. I backed away quickly. My breathing accelerated. The sun continued to cover the clearing with its pale light, but everything seemed darker than it really was. Something wasn't right. I felt I should leave, but as I turned around, the sound of the wind stopped being the only one in the air. I heard something, a whisper. It wasn't clear, but I felt that something or someone was watching me from somewhere. I turned around and looked around. Nothing, just the trees and the empty clearing. But that sensation, that strange pressure in the air didn't disappear. I took a deep breath and began to walk quickly toward the exit of the clearing. The route I had followed to get there seemed like the only option to get out. But as I advanced a few steps, the sensation of being watched only intensified. My gaze constantly diverted toward the trees, toward the shadows. Something wasn't right. Suddenly I heard a crackling, a step. It was a dull sound, as if someone was walking on dry leaves, but I couldn't see anyone. I stopped dead, my rifle ready in my hands. I looked ahead, to the side, even behind me. Nothing. I started walking again, this time at a much faster pace. The more I advanced, the more it seemed that the shadows between the trees were moving. Suddenly, the crackling of the ground seemed closer, a repeated sound, as if someone was following my steps. I stopped looking back. Fear took hold of me with such force that I didn't want to confirm what I already knew. Someone, or something, was following me. Every step I took seemed to be replicated by another behind me. The crunching of leaves, the brushing of branches were now unmistakable. I couldn't be wrong. I was being pursued. My breathing became more agitated, my steps faster. Every time I felt the space between the trees closing. Suddenly, as if something pushed me, I launched into a run. The forest seemed to stretch out, the shadows denser, as if the very branches of the forest were trying to trap me. I looked back again and saw a figure among the trees. I couldn't distinguish it well, but it was there, moving with the same speed as me, as if someone was following me with the same desperation. I accelerated even more, my legs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of the steps behind me didn't cease, but when I looked for the last time, the figure had disappeared. The forest continued to be as dense, but the pursuit ceased as suddenly as it began. However, I didn't dare to stop. When I reached the edge of the clearing, where the route opened again toward the safer zone, I felt the air finally return to normal. But the sensation of being watched, of having been followed, never disappeared. That night, already at home, I couldn't help but think about the corpse in the clearing. I didn't know if I had seen something I shouldn't have, or if what I felt was a product of my fear. The mystery of the dead man gnawed at me, but even more, the sensation that something or someone was there in the forest waiting gnawed at me. Last night's sleep eluded me. I lay down in bed, but my mind wouldn't stop reviewing every detail of what happened in the forest, every cracking, every shadow, every step I had heard and couldn't identify. Although I was at home, surrounded by the comforts that civilization offers, fear was still very present in me, like a shadow that wouldn't leave me in peace. I decided I had to go back the next day. I needed to know what had really happened in that clearing, to understand what I had seen. Dawn came with a cloudy sky, which only added a gray tone to the atmosphere. I prepared my equipment, making sure to carry my rifle more out of habit than necessity. Although I wasn't planning to face anything, the fact that I hadn't found clear answers made me feel vulnerable. The journey to the clearing was long, but I knew it well. It wasn't the first time I had traveled that stretch of forest. When I arrived at the area, the stillness was even more disturbing than the night before. The air was charged with humidity, and the place seemed wrapped in a light fog that made everything even more somber. I entered the same path I had traveled the day before, trying not to let the sensation of being watched consume me again. When I reached the clearing, my heart skipped a beat. It was empty, as if everything I had lived the night before was a product of my imagination. but I couldn't fool myself. I knew what I had seen. I decided to advance a little more toward where I had found the corpse. As I approached, my steps became more cautious. The grass was flattened, as if someone had walked there recently. The sensation that I wasn't alone increased with every step I took. When I reached the exact spot, my eyes desperately searched for any sign of the man I had found the day before, but the body wasn't there. There was no trace of it, no blood, no clothes, nothing that could indicate something had happened in that place, as if the corpse had never been there. I stood there looking around, my breathing heavier now. The wind blew stronger, but the creaking of branches and the whisper of leaves didn't calm me. I turned around looking for some indication of what had happened. Maybe someone had moved it. Maybe it had been my mistake. Maybe. But the thought that the scene had completely disappeared didn't leave me calm. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a crackling. It wasn't from an animal or the wind. It was a step, the same type of step I had heard the night before. A dull sound, as if someone was walking through the bushes. My heart began to beat faster, and the skin on my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, but I saw nothing. The clearing was as empty as always, but the sensation that something was watching me was much stronger than the night before. I couldn't stay there. A primal impulse pushed me to leave that place as soon as possible. I began to walk quickly, almost running, looking for the return path, but the steps I heard behind me didn't cease. I felt someone was following me, but I couldn't see them. The pressure in my chest increased, and my breathing became labored. I constantly looked around, but the forest remained silent, as if nothing was happening. However, the crackling continued, always at the same rhythm, always behind me, like a shadow I could never reach. I accelerated my pace, wanting to reach the exit of the clearing, to the more open area where I could see if someone was chasing me. But as I went deeper into the forest, the sensation of being followed intensified. The air seemed to become denser, the shadows longer, and the crackling of branches under my boots made me feel I wasn't alone. The pressure was unbearable. When I finally managed to reach a more open area, I stopped. I looked around, sweating and with my heart about to explode. There was nothing. The forest, the clearing, everything seemed to be as quiet as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was behind me. I turned once more with the rifle in my hands, prepared for whatever was there. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I didn't see it, but I perceived it. A chill ran down my spine, and sweat began to form on my forehead. It wasn't fear. It was something more primal, more ancient, something you only feel when you know you're being stalked. I felt the need to look back, but instead of doing so, I ran without thinking toward the path that would take me back to civilization. I ran without stopping, without looking back. The sound of my steps echoed in my ears, but something inside me told me I shouldn't stop, that I should reach the town, the houses, the people. I didn't know what was in that forest, but I felt I shouldn't be there. I didn't understand what was happening, but my instinct told me something had changed in that place. When I finally reached the entrance to the town, the fog disappeared and the air felt lighter. The weight I had carried for hours seemed to vanish, but the fear was still there. I walked quickly toward my house, the rifle still in my hands, as if I was expecting something. My body was exhausted, but my mind remained alert, as if a last surprise was waiting for me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about the corpse, about the steps, about the presence I felt behind me. Nobody else had seen anything strange, but I knew what I had experienced. Nobody would believe me. Nobody would understand. I was alone with my fear and my memories. The next day I returned to the forest, but I found nothing. The clearing was empty, as if nothing had happened. There were no footprints, no trace of what I had seen, nor of the dead man. Everything seemed to be in its place, and the fear I felt had no form. The reality is that I never knew what happened in that clearing. Nobody believed me, neither in the town nor in the surroundings. But I know what I felt, what I saw, and what I heard. Sometimes forests keep secrets that shouldn't be discovered, and there are things that can't be explained. Since that day, I never hunted in that area again. But every time I close my eyes, the crackling of leaves and the steps I can't see are still there, pursuing me in the darkness. To this day, when I close my eyes, the image that forms is that of Mr. Gerald's window. It was an enormous window, disproportionate to the facade of that simple house, and it occupied almost all the space next to the door. He never bothered to put up a curtain, privacy film, nothing. I think deep down maybe he wanted to be seen, or more likely, he simply did not care. For us, the kids on the block, that window was an invitation. It was impossible not to look inside every time we passed by. Our street had nothing special about it. It was a common place with houses with low fences, iron gates that always needed a coat of paint, and one or two fruit trees that made a mess on the sidewalk. And in the middle of that scenery existed Gerald. At that time, he must have been in his late 40s, maybe 50 years old, a solitary figure who received no visitors and only set foot outside to go to the market or pay some bill at the corner store. What made him the center of our attention was his way of being. Mr. Gerald liked to wear dresses. They were always colorful models with flower or polka dot prints that he wore to be at home. We saw his silhouette move through the window, sometimes with a ribbon or bow tying his hair that he kept long well below his shoulders. He spent hours arranging a collection of dolls on a shelf that was clearly visible, and he talked to them. We could not hear what he said, but we saw his mouth move, gesticulating. For a gang of 10, 11-year-old kids, that was everything we wanted to make fun of. And being honest, for a certain kind of fear too. Our entertainment at the end of the afternoon was that. After playing football until we were tired, we would gather in front of his house. We shouted the cruelest and most idiotic things we could think of. We called him everything. Sometimes he would come out, open the door slowly as if his body hurt, pick up some small stones from the street and throw them in our direction, but without force, without the slightest intention of hitting us. It was almost a ritual. He would chase us away. We would run away laughing and go look for something else to do. It was a routine of childish evil that at the time seemed like just a game. I was always there in the middle of the group, maybe to feel part of something. I was one of the ones who shouted the most. Today, just remembering it makes me sick. It is very easy to be brave in a group, even more so against someone that deep down we all knew was not going to really fight back. The part that really caused me a strange sensation, even more than the dresses and long hair, was the doll collection. Most seemed to be plastic or some kind of porcelain, those you find in thrift stores, already half discolored by time. But among them were some that seemed to be made by him. They were different. One in particular caught my attention. It was always in the corner of the shelf, a crooked rag doll with a soft and disproportionate body and two large black buttons sewn in place of eyes. Unlike the other toys that looked inward, that doll seemed to always be turned toward the window, looking toward the street, toward us. It happened once on a Saturday afternoon, a hot and muggy day. We were playing football, and in a completely misdirected shot I made, the ball rose, passed over the low fence, and fell right in the middle of Gerald's neglected garden. At that same instant, everyone fell silent. All eyes turned to me. "Well, Anthony, go get it," said Gregory, who was the biggest in the gang, with that sideways smile. "Or are you going to let the weirdo keep your ball?" I did not want to go, really. I felt a reluctance I could not explain well. I stood there, feeling the sun burn my neck, trying to muster courage or think of some excuse, but the pressure of the stairs was worse than fear. I started walking slowly to his small gate, which was always just leaning closed. When my hand touched the cold iron, the house door opened. Mr. Gerald appeared. He was not wearing a dress that day, just some worn pants and a plain, very old t-shirt. He walked to the ball, bent down with some difficulty, took it with both hands, and came in my direction. He stopped in front of me on the other side of the gate and extended the ball to me. He did not say a single word, just looked into my eyes. It was not a look of anger or contempt. It was a look of deep tiredness, a sadness that I was too young to be able to name, but that I felt. For an instant, I felt sorry for him. "Come on, Anthony, take it already." "Are you scared?" shouted one of the kids from behind, breaking the silence. The shame of seeming weak in front of the others spoke louder. It was stronger than me. I snatched the ball from his hand, and without thinking I blurted out, "Stay away from us, weirdo." I saw something change in his face. That tiredness seemed to double its weight. He did not respond. He simply turned around. He walked back inside and closed the door. I returned to the game trying to seem like the tough guy, but the rest of the afternoon had no fun at all. The image of that look would not leave my head. It was the first time our game completely lost its meaning for me. Some weeks passed after the episode with the ball. I distanced myself from the provocations. I made up any excuse and went home earlier, but the rest of the gang continued with the same routine. The only difference is that now I observed from afar, from my room window, with a bad taste in my mouth, until the night came that changed everything forever. I remember it was a much colder night than normal for that time of year. The air was freezing, cutting, and the cold crept through the cracks of the windows in a way that made the skin hurt a little. Outside, a thin layer of dew already covered the cars. I woke up in the middle of the night. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning, with a strange sound coming from the street. It was not a scream of pain or fright. It was more like a conversation, a loud and desperate plea. I got up carefully and went to spy through the crack in the blinds. The lights in some neighboring houses began to turn on too. Down there in the middle of the deserted street was Mr. Gerald. He was wearing one of his flowered dresses over sweatpants. He was not talking to anyone I could see. He walked from side to side, hugging his own body, and looked toward the dark windows of the houses, at the tops of the trees, at the sky. "Leave me alone." His voice came out trembling, broken. "I know you are there, I hear you." My father appeared at my room door with his face wrinkled from sleep. "What is that racket?" "Oh, it is just Gerald. Leave him, he probably got drunk. Tomorrow it will pass." And he went back to bed. But I continued there watching. He crouched on the edge of the sidewalk, as if trying to protect himself from something coming from above. "They whisper through the cracks," he spoke now lower, almost to himself, shaking his head. "The watchers said they are coming." Nobody came down, nobody did anything. The neighbors' lights went out one by one. The show was over. After a while, he got up staggering and went into his house. The silence that remained afterwards was one of the heaviest things I have felt. I knew with a certainty that gave me chills that this was not alcohol or common madness. He was afraid, really afraid. And after that night, we never saw Mr. Gerald at the window again. The next day, the first thing I did when I woke up was run to my room window. Mr. Gerald's house was still there, motionless, but there was something very different. The immense window, which had always been a kind of stage open to the street, was now completely covered. He had pasted old newspaper sheets from the inside, held with pieces of brown tape. It was a visibly hurried job, poorly done. The yellowed sheets and old headlines created an opaque and ugly collage, a barrier that practically screamed, "Do not look here." That ceiling changed the dynamics of the entire block. The focus of our attention had suddenly disappeared. The first days, Gregory and the others still tried their luck. They went to the front of the house. They shouted the same nicknames as before. The response was absolute silence, a dense silence that seemed to absorb the words. They threw one or two small stones at the wooden door that produced a dull thud. No echo, nothing, no movement, no shadow moving behind the newspapers. That complete lack of reaction was much more disturbing than the stones he used to throw back. The game, if it ever was won, completely lost its fun, because his silence was heavy, intimidating. In less than a week, the kids gave up and found another corner for their mischief. Mr. Gerald's house became a kind of blind spot on the street. People passed by it, but pretended not to notice it. It was easier to simply ignore it. I, however, could not. Every day I looked at that covered window and felt a growing nervousness inside me. What would be happening in there? Was he okay? Was he sick? The image of him crouched in the middle of the street, talking about the watchers, kept coming back to my mind without me wanting it to. My guilt for that last thing I said to him mixed with genuine fear for what could be happening to him at that precise moment. The weeks went by. 1, 2, then 3. No sign of life, no light turned on at night. The trash was not taken out. The house gradually acquired an aspect of abandonment, even though it was supposedly inhabited. It was as if time had frozen in there, behind those newspaper sheets. Dust began to accumulate on the small front porch. Dry leaves brought by the wind gathered in the corner of the door. The garden weeds started to grow out of control, invading the sidewalk. The house was becoming an empty shell right before our eyes until one night during dinner, my mother turned to me. She had a way of asking things that seemed casual, but I knew never was. "Son, tell me something. Have you and your friends seen that neighbor of yours, Gerald?" Her question left everything silent for a moment. The noise of the silverware stopped. "No, Mom," I replied, pushing a piece of vegetable around the plate. "Not for a long time. Nobody sees him anymore." My mother exchanged a worried look with my father, and I knew at that exact moment that the silence had finally become too loud for everyone to ignore. The conversation during our dinner was enough. The next day I saw my mother talking at the gate with Miss Alice from the corner house, who in turn spoke with Mr. Robert from across the street. By the end of that same afternoon, a small group of neighbors was formed in front of Gerald's house. My father was among them. I stayed a little behind, near our gate, with my heart a little more accelerated, observing everything. They started by calling him by name. They knocked on the door, first with knuckles, then with the palm of their hand. The sound that came back was hollow, lifeless. "Mr. Gerald, everything okay in there?" Mr. Roberts' voice sounded muffled by the wood, getting no response at all. The group went around the house. They tried to force their view through the other windows, but they were all closed and apparently secured from the inside. The apprehension among them was visible. They exchanged looks, whispers, not knowing exactly what the next step was. It was my father who said what everyone was already thinking. "Look, there is no other way. We are going to have to go in. If something happened to the man in there, every minute we lose out here is a risk." The decision was made. Mr. Robert, who was stronger, positioned himself in front of the door. After 2 or 3 strong charges with his shoulder, the wood around the lock creaked, but did not give. On the 4th attempt, with the help of another neighbor pushing together, the door finally opened with a crash, hitting the inside wall and revealing the darkness of the living room. A strange smell came out from inside the house at that same instant. A smell of dust, of a closed place, but mixed with something else. A kind of sweet and chemical smell that vaguely reminded me of mothballs or naphthalene, something used to store old clothes or preserve animals. The adults hesitated for a moment at the threshold before entering. I crept closer and managed to spy between their legs. The house was in almost perfect order, but completely silent and motionless. There was a thin layer of dust on all the furniture, the kind of dust that accumulates in a few weeks of absence. On the dining table, a piece of bread already hard as a stone was next to a cup with some cold black coffee at the bottom. The scene was frozen in time. It was as if the person who lived there had gotten up mid-bite to open the door or do something else, and had simply never returned to finish. While the other neighbors opened the doors to the bedrooms and bathrooms shouting his name, I walked almost automatically toward the main wall of the living room. I needed to see his shelf. The clothes, including the flowered dresses, were all hanging in a closet with the doors open. But my focus was elsewhere. The long shelf with the doll collection was there. The plastic ones, the porcelain ones, all in a row, covered by the same thin layer of dust that covered the rest of the house. They seemed to look at us with their glass eyes, empty and indifferent. I scanned the entire row with my eyes, one by one, looking, and then my stomach seemed to sink. The rag doll, that crooked one, with the black buttons, was not there. Its place in the corner of the shelf was empty. There was a cleaner mark in the dust, a perfect rectangle that showed exactly where it used to be. It had been removed recently. I got a little closer, feeling my heart beat harder in my chest. And it was there, very close to the shelf, that I felt that chemical smell again, much stronger now, seeming to come from that empty spot on the shelf. It was a smell of old things, of preservation, a smell that did not belong in that place. Nobody found anything in the house, no sign of struggle, no note, no packed suitcase. Mr. Gerald had evaporated, and with him had taken the only thing from that house, that for me had always seemed to be looking outward. They called the police. Of course, they asked questions, took notes, but there was no body or crime scene, no concrete clues. The official story, the one the neighborhood adopted to be able to sleep in peace, was that Gerald simply got tired of everything and left. Some even fantasized that he had found a lover in another city and had run away to live his life. It was an explanation that calmed everyone, but not me. A man who leaves coffee and bread half-finished on the table is not a man who planned his departure. The years passed. Mr. Gerald's house remained empty for a long time until it was sold and completely remodeled by a new family who had no idea of its history. I grew up, moved from that street, but the memory of that place never left me. The guilt for the way I treated him, especially in that last encounter at the gate, became a weight I carry. I always wonder if things would have been different if I or anyone else had shown him a minimum of compassion that night when he was pleading in the street. If our childish cruelty did not leave him even more exposed and vulnerable to whatever came looking for him. I never knew what the Watchers really were, if they were beings from another place, if they were spirits, or if they were just the delirium of the tormented mind of a very lonely man. That doubt accompanied me for more than 20 years until yesterday. Now I live in an apartment in a busy neighborhood many miles away from my old house. Yesterday, when I got home from work, the doorman handed me a package, a small cardboard box closed with tape. No return address, only my name and address, written in unsteady and trembling handwriting. I was not expecting any package. I thought maybe it was something for the previous tenant, a mail error, but my name was there, unmistakable. I opened the box right there on the kitchen counter with a curiosity that now mixed with slight strangeness. Inside, wrapped in yellowed and fragile tissue paper, was an object. It was a crooked rag doll with a soft and disproportionate body and with 2 large black buttons sewn in place of eyes. It was him, the same doll that disappeared from Mr. Gerald's shelf. I felt my face freeze. My hands began to tremble in a way I could not control. How was it possible? Who could have sent it? That is when I noticed the final detail. Pinned to the doll's chest with an old and rusty diaper pin, there was a small photo of those school-size ones, discolored by time. It was my photo from my school ID. Me at 11 years old, hair cut in a bowl cut and a graceless smile. The same age I was when all of that happened. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.